David Lind.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and with your permission I will answer questions 5 and 13 together. We have worked hand in hand with the devolved administration since the start of the outbreak, including through the COBRA ministerial committees and the ministerial implementation groups. We have noted 112 engagements in total since the 23rd of March, and the number continues to rise.
I want to associate myself with the point made by the Honourable Member for Presley Pembrokeshire, because there is a danger with the wind down of the furlough scheme that will have an impact on the hospitality and tourism sector in Wales. Now, given that that is a policy that is going to be directed from London, does it not therefore make the case for the devolution of fiscal powers so that the Welsh Government can continue to support businesses for so long as is necessary?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think that the UK Government have already made it very clear that they're supporting Welsh businesses. We've had the CBIL scheme, the large business scheme, the furlough scheme, the self-employed scheme, and various other schemes as well. We have shown at all times the flexibility and the commitment to support industry, including the tourism industry, and I welcome the interactions I've had with members of the Scottish Government as well as with the Welsh Government on the...
Alison Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From the outset of this pandemic, the UK Government said that its approach would be a four-nation approach, which requires shared evidence and transparency about how decisions are made. But two unilateral decisions have been made this past week without consulting or forewarning the Welsh Government, firstly on shielding advice and secondly on university numbers, which affects Glasgow Central as it does Wales. So how can the UK Government claim to be respecting that four-nation approach? Is it not less hand-in-hand than thumbing a nose?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm reliably informed that in actual fact there has been a great deal of consultation with Welsh Government on university numbers, and of course shielding is a devolved matter, and the Honourable Lady surely wouldn't expect us to trample all over the devolution settlement. But what I think is very important to say is that the people of the United Kingdom, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland and England expect politicians to put aside political grandstanding at the time of this crisis and work together, and the UK Government is committed to doing that.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
ONS figures show that the number of people claiming job seekers allowances and universal credit and Dwyfil Meirionnydd has increased by 124% since the start of lockdown. This is the biggest increase in any Welsh constituency. A pattern is appearing across Wales and the UK, with regions heavily dependent on tourism and hospitality seeing a desperate increase in unemployment. We will see a corresponding increase in rural poverty if these businesses are left defenceless and facing a three-winter scenario. Will he commit today to working with the Welsh Government to create a tailored, long-term package to guarantee the long-term future of the Welsh tourism and hospitality sector?
Well, given what you have a question, it's quite obvious that the lockdown is going to have a huge impact on our economy, and it is going to increase unemployment figures, and that is why the UK Government are committed to coming out of lockdown as quickly as it is safe to do so, and I hope the Welsh Government will, and that members of Plaid Cymru will also support that. But I said earlier on, Mr. Speaker, that we look forward to rolling out a red and green carpet to visitors from across the United Kingdom, and we want to make absolutely certain that we don't see signs going up in parts of rural Wales saying English people are not welcome here. We welcome tourists from all parts of the United Kingdom and beyond to see what Wales has got to offer, and I hope the Honourable Lady will talk to members of local authorities across North Wales and emphasise that message.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
I think some more specific support would have been more useful rather than political points. He says that both governments will work together, but we know from this week's students' number controls announcement in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, this was brought out without any consultation whatsoever with Welsh Government. Given his role in the government and his role representing Wales, what is he doing to protect the interests of the Welsh higher education sector from such potentially damaging effects and decisions made by his government?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've discussed this very issue with my officials this morning. I'm assured that there was consultation between the Wales and the UK Government, and that this is a UK-wide scheme that has been put in place to protect universities and to stop people from poaching students from each other across the United Kingdom. And I can only say once again, Mr. Speaker, that the UK Government is completely committed to consultation with Welsh Government. We have made absolutely certain that Welsh Government ministers are made welcome at the COBRA meetings and the ministerial implementation groups, and we have actually asked if we could attend Welsh Government meetings in the same way. Thus far we haven't had a response, but if the Honourable Lady is able to put pressure on her friends in the Assembly to allow Welsh Government ministers to attend Welsh Government meetings, then we would be happy to do so.
Faye Jones.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The First Minister and members of the Welsh Government have been closely involved in all aspects of the UK Government's coronavirus response. But despite this, the First Minister has been continually critical of the UK Government. Can my right honourable friend put these criticisms to bed and outline just how engaged the UK Government has been with the Welsh Government?
Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, as I've already mentioned, we have had 130 meetings at which Welsh Government ministers have been present, and we very much hope that the Welsh Government will take a similar view about the importance of having UK Government representation at their meetings, and we look forward to invitations coming to myself, my honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Wales, from the Welsh Government shortly.
Craig Williams.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State and the Minister for their mature approach to the Welsh Government and engaging on so many levels. He was right, my honourable friend, to outline tourism is important to Wales, and the language as we come out of this lockdown and the relationship between the two governments and working together is key for my constituency, Montgomeryshire, and the tourist industry. Will he meet with me, and will he also push the Welsh Government to work together on coming out of lockdown?
Minister.
I would be delighted to meet with the honourable gentleman to talk about how we can support tourism after the crisis is over, as we will be meeting with many other representatives of industry groups, automotive sector, the defence sector, the aerospace sector, to discuss how we can support those sectors also.
Simon Benz.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Transport is an important area of intergovernmental relations between the Welsh and Westminster governments. Would the Minister agree that both governments' transport investment plans are even of greater importance as we come out of the crisis? And would he meet with me to discuss the need in Clwyd South for projects such as step-free access at Rwabon Station?
Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'd be delighted to discuss step-free access at Rwabon Station with the honourable gentleman, and I hope that I will be able to give him news of much greater infrastructure projects to rail and road that will be on offer to Wales once this crisis is over.
Robert Courts.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Number 6.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I regularly discuss with the Welsh Government the vital role of the UK's armed forces in supporting Wales in its fight against COVID-19, whether it's getting PPE to those who need it, establishing testing sites or driving and decontaminating ambulances. The response of our servicemen and women is testament to how strong we are as members of the United Kingdom.
Robert Courts.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for that answer. Our armed forces have been active in all corners of the United Kingdom during this crisis, and we see this particularly clearly in my own constituency, where the Royal Air Force's transport fleet is based. Would the Secretary of State agree that it's when we look at the dedication and the reach of our armed forces that we see the perfect illustration of what our family of nations, this union, can achieve?
Secretary of State.
Mr Speaker, indeed, my honourable friend makes a really good point really well, and there are so many examples of where this is the case. I'm just aware that in Wales alone, a fifth of ambulance shifts and decontamination of over 2,000 ambulances has just been done without seeking praise or reward or recognition. It's just part of what the armed forces do. They do it in a fantastically sort of clear and brave and professional manner, and the idea that that could be a service provided if we had a broken up United Kingdom is a complete fantasy, and I wish there were that some of the sort of separatist noises which we occasionally hear in this chamber just recognise that.
Chris Elmore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. There can be no doubt of the importance of the military in terms of supporting the people of Wales during the pandemic. So can I press the Secretary of State to do all he can to ensure that the base in Brecon is kept in Wales in his discussions with the Secretary of State for Defence?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Indeed, the military footprint is, as it's called, is incredibly important. It's important for lots of reasons, economic reasons being high amongst them. I have regular conversations with the various brigadiers and individuals based in Brecon and elsewhere across Wales, and they are as enthusiastic about the Honourable Gentleman's comments as I am, and it is a shared ambition to make sure that this we deliver on our military footprint.
Christian Wakefield.
Question number 7, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Mr Speaker, there is no doubt that COVID will have an enormous and detrimental impact on the Welsh economy. The government is doing everything it can to support business and individuals through the pandemic and ensure that the economy recovers as quickly as possible. I am confident that our policies are the right one to defeat this virus and to save jobs in Wales.
Christian Wakefield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for that response. Although our efforts are rightly focused on tackling the coronavirus pandemic, we also need to continue building on our cross-border economic activity. This is more important now more than ever. Can the Minister tell me what initiatives his department has put in place to strengthen the economic links between Wales and the northwest of England?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think it is heartening to see that the Welsh Government have adopted a number of UK-wide programmes, such as the UK-wide coronavirus testing portal. A UK-wide union approach is key as we move to the next phase. And it is disappointing that sometimes the Welsh Government have taken a little time to come on board with UK-wide schemes. On the issue of testing, England has tested around 2.5 times per head more people than Wales. I look forward to closer cooperation in future.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm thinking in particular as we move into the next phase of the COVID-19 crisis about the steel industry, especially in South Wales. And of course we know how vital it is for jobs and livelihoods across the UK, but especially in Newport West in places like Island Steel. So can I ask what discussions the Secretary of State has had with his Cabinet colleagues about the steps the UK Government plans to take to protect the UK steel industry?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady makes a very important point. The steel industry is vital to the UK and to Wales, and my honourable friend and myself have had discussions with the sector. But we have, as she will be aware, already put in place a range of schemes that companies like Tata and Celsa are taking advantage of. The C-bills, CL bills, the VAT deferral, the Corona Corporation Corporate Finance Facility, and so on. But we will be very happy to have further discussions about specific proposals that could help that industry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week is National Volunteer Week, and will the Secretary of State join me in thanking the hidden heroes in my constituency of Ynysmore and all across Wales? 5-year-old Alfie making rainbows, Stace Weeder sewing. And can we please thank these people who are working so hard to protect the vulnerable at this exceptional time?
One Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I absolutely support the hidden heroes and the not so hidden heroes. I've been delighted to take part in the clapping every Thursday for the NHS and for all members of the emergency service.
Elder Smith.
Number 9, sir.
Secretary of State or Minister, whichever.
Indeed, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've had regular discussions with businesses from North Wales, including a recent webinar with the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for Business and Industry and the Welsh Government Minister for the Economy and Transport. And earlier this week, I had a wide-ranging and useful meeting with the North Wales Economic Ambition Board.
McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for his reply. Obviously, what happens in North Wales matters to people in the Wirral. The Welsh Government takes a social partnership approach involving employers and trade unions in the situation that we face. So in all those meetings that the Minister's just described, can he tell me, does he take that same social partnership approach?
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to say that I do, and it may surprise the Honourable Lady. I was being cut short earlier on, but one of the very useful meetings I had was with the trade union representatives from across Wales, and I was delighted with the very constructive approach which they have. They are as keen as we are to see Welsh businesses up and running as quickly as possible.
Tonya.
Number 10, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Thanks, Speaker. I've had regular discussions with the Chancellor to ensure the right financial support is available to people in Wales and across the United Kingdom to help people through the COVID-19 outbreak.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the UK Government wants to tax the one-off thank you payment that the Welsh Government are going to make to carers in Wales. As the Secretary of State goes out and claps on a Thursday evening, he should ask himself and maybe explain to the people of Wales, especially if he refuses to stand up for the people of Wales, allowing his Tory government to shortchange the Welsh carers who have looked after our most vulnerable. What is the point of his role?
Mr. Speaker, if there had been a little bit of earlier consultation around it, we might have been able to advise the Welsh Government on how that problem could have been overcome. As it happened, we have made some suggestions to the Welsh Government about how that gift to care workers is properly made, without the need for primary legislation, which is where we are at the current time. And I would also urge her, if she is as concerned as she is about this, to make sure that everybody in the care sector receives a similar act of generosity from Welsh Government.
We've now come to an end. I'm going to give a minute suspension to allow those who don't need to be in the chamber to make way for those that need to come on. Right, let us begin. Question 1, Rachel Maskell.
Thank you. Number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Tomorrow I will open the Global Vaccine Summit. The UK-hosted virtual event will bring together more than 50 countries as well as leaders of private sector organisations and civil society to raise at least $7.4 billion for Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance. And tomorrow's Global Vaccine Summit should be the moment when the world comes together to unite humanity in the fight against disease. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others in addition to my duties in this House. I shall have further such meetings later today.
Rachel Maskell.
As the Prime Minister obfuscates over his adviser, the real scandal of the coronavirus pandemic has been exposed in the Public Health England report published yesterday. Inequality and poverty. If you are black or Asian, if you are poor, if you have a low-skilled job, the mortality risk is up to double that of the rest of the population, the poorest having the greatest exposure, risk and fate. And now the government is seriously increasing that exposure and risk with its easement announcements. Why won't the Prime Minister publish a full health and economic risk assessment for public scrutiny to protect us all from this deadly virus?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question, and this government commissioned the review from Public Health England, and we take its findings very seriously because there obviously are inequalities in the way that the virus impacts on different people, different communities in our country. And my right honourable friend, the Minister for Equalities, the member for Saffron Waldron, will be looking at what next practical steps we need to do to protect all our country from coronavirus.
Scott Benson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the past few weeks, Blackpool has been inundated with visitors, and the images of people not social distancing and leaving our beach strewn with litter have angered my constituents at a time when they are doing the right thing and following the government's advice. The fact that Blackpool has one of the highest local infection rates in the nation has only served to heighten these fears. What assistance is the government providing to areas such as Blackpool to deal with the influx of visitors at a time when local services are already under pressure?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, he well represents Blackpool, his constituents, sticking up for the interests of Blackpool. In addition to the $3.2 billion we're already given to local councils to help combat corona, Blackpool is receiving another £9 million in particular, as well as the funding from the High Street Funds and the Town Fund to deal with the particular problems that he rightly identifies.
Leader of the Opposition, Sir Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by expressing shock and anger at the death of George Floyd? This has shone a light on racism and hatred experienced by many in the US and beyond. I'm surprised the Prime Minister hasn't said anything about this yet, but I do hope that next time he speaks to President Trump, he will convey to him the UK's abhorrence about his response to the events. Mr. Speaker, the Telegraph this morning is reporting that the Prime Minister has decided to take direct control of the government's response to the virus. So an obvious question for the Prime Minister, who's been in direct control up till now?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me begin by associating myself absolutely with what the right honourable gentleman had to say about the death of George Floyd. And I think what happened in the United States was appalling. It was inexcusable. We all saw it on our screens. And I perfectly understand people's right to protest what took place, though obviously I also believe that protests should take place in a lawful and reasonable way. On his more polemical point, let me just say that this government is, I take full responsibility for everything this government has been doing in tackling coronavirus, and I'm very proud of our record. And if you look at what we have achieved so far, it is very considerable. We have protected the NHS. We have driven down the death rate. We are now seeing far fewer hospital admissions, and I believe I believe that the public understand that with good British common sense, we will continue to defeat this virus and take this country forward. And what I think the country would like to hear from him is more signs of cooperation in that endeavour.
Mr. Speaker, he asked for a sign of cooperation, a fair challenge. I wrote to him, as he knows, in confidence 2 weeks ago, to ask if I could help build the consensus for getting children back into our schools. I did it confidentially and privately because I didn't want to make a lot of it. He hasn't replied. Mr. Speaker, this is a critical week in our response to COVID-19. Whereas lockdown and stay at home were relatively easy messages, easing restrictions involves very difficult judgment calls. So this is the week of all weeks where public trust and confidence in the government needed to be at its highest. But as the director of the Reuters Institute, which commissioned a YouGov poll this weekend, said, I have never, in 10 years of research, seen a drop in trust like we've seen for the UK government. How worried is the Prime Minister about this loss of trust?
Prime Minister.
I'm surprised he should take that tone, Mr. Speaker, since I took the trouble to ring him up, and we had a long conversation in which I briefed the right honourable gentleman about all the steps that we were taking. He didn't offer any dissent at that stage, I may say, Mr. Speaker. He thoroughly endorsed our approach, and I believe that he should continue to endorse it today. I think that he's on better ground and firmer ground when he stands with the overwhelming majority of the British people who understand the very, very difficult circumstances that we are in and who want clarity across the political spectrum, but who believe that we can move forward, provided we continue to observe the basic rules on social distancing, on washing our hands, and on making sure that when we have symptoms, we take a test and we isolate. And I think everybody understands that. That's why the incidence of this disease is coming down. And I think his attempts to distract the public from that have not been successful, because they continue to pay attention to our guidance.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister challenges me on the offer I made to him. This was a confidential letter. I think the best thing I can do is put it in the public domain, and the public can decide for themselves how constructive we're being. Mr. Speaker, 2 weeks ago today at the dispatch box, the Prime Minister promised that we will have a test, track and trace operation that will be world-beating. And yes, it will be in place by the 1st of June. But it isn't. And a critical element, the ability of local authorities to respond to local spikes, is missing. As one council leader put it to us, we're weeks away from having this fully up and running. We simply weren't given enough warning. The Prime Minister mutters it's not true. Dido Harding, the Prime Minister's own chair of the track and trace system, has said that this element will not be ready until the end of June. The Prime Minister must have been briefed on this problem before he made that promise 2 weeks ago. So why did he make that promise?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid he's casting aspersions on the efforts of tens of thousands of people who have set up a test, track and trace system in this country from a standing start. We now have 40,000 people engaged in this. Every person, thousands of people are being tested, as he knows, every day. Every person who tests positive in this country in the track and trace system is contacted. Then thousands of their contacts are themselves contacted, people they've been in contact with. And I can tell the House, at the moment, as a result of our test, track and trace system, which was up and running on the 1st of June, as I said, Mr. Speaker, contrary to what he said, which was up and running, as a result of their efforts, thousands of people are now following our guidance, following the law, and self-isolating to stop the spread of the disease.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome that news from the Prime Minister. He didn't put a number on those that have been traced. But as he knows, the number of people testing positive for COVID-19 every day is only a fraction of those actually infected every day. According to the ONS, the number actually infected every day is between 7,000 and 9,000. Assuming up to 5 contacts need to be traced for every infected person, the system probably needs to reach 45,000 people a day. So there's a long way to go. And I'm sure if it is 45,000 a day, the Prime Minister will confirm that in just a minute. But the problem when the Prime Minister used statistics is that the Statistics Authority have had concerns on more than one occasion. Yesterday, in a strongly worded letter to the Health Secretary, the chair of the UK Statistics Authority said that the statistics still fall well short of expectations. He went on to say, "It is not surprising that given their inadequacy, data on testing are so widely criticised and so often mistrusted." Can the Prime Minister see how damaging this is to public trust and confidence in his government?
I must say to the Honourable Gentleman, I really do not see the purpose of his endless attacks on public trust and confidence, when what we are trying to do, and I think what the public want to hear from politicians across all parties, are clear messages about how to defeat this virus. Test and trace is a vital tool in our armoury, and contrary to what he says, actually, we did by the end of May get up to 100,000 tests a day. And we got up to 200,000 by the beginning of this month, and that was an astonishing achievement, not by government but by tens of thousands of people working to support government. And I think he should pay tribute to them and what they've achieved.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is confusing scrutiny for attacks. I have supported the government openly, and I've taken criticism for it, but boy, he makes it difficult to support this government over the last 2 weeks. Mr. Speaker, another critical issue on trust and confidence is transparency about decision-making. On the 10th of May, the Prime Minister said, on the question of lifting restrictions, if the alert level won't allow it, we will simply wait and go on until we've got it right. At the time when he said that, the alert level was 4, and the R rate was between 0.5 and 0.9. We're now 3 weeks on. Some restrictions have been lifted. So can the Prime Minister tell us what's the alert level now and what's the R rate now?
Prime Minister. He knows perfectly well that the alert level does allow it, and indeed he didn't raise that issue with me when we had a conversation on the telephone, and he knows the reason we've been able to make the progress that we have is that the 5 tests have been fulfilled. So yes, the alert level remains at 4, but as Sage will confirm, we've managed to protect the NHS. We've got the rate of deaths down. We've got the rate of infection down. The PPE crisis, the difficulties in care homes, the question of the R, they have been addressed. And I think the question for him, Mr. Speaker, is whether he actually supports the progress we're making. Because at the weekend he was backing it. Now he's doing a U-turn. Now he seems to be against the steps that this country is taking.
Keir Starmer.
I've supported the government in the gradual easing of restrictions. That is why I wrote to the Prime Minister 2 weeks ago, because I could see the problem with schools, and I thought it needed leadership and consensus, and I privately offered to do what I could to build that consensus. That's the offer that wasn't taken up. Mr. Speaker, can I finally turn to the question of Parliament? Mr. Speaker, I know you feel very strongly about this. The scenes yesterday of MPs queuing to vote and members being unable to vote were frankly shameful. This should not be a political issue. Members on all sides know that this is completely unnecessary and unacceptable. If any other employer behaved like this, it would be a clear and obvious case of indirect discrimination under the Equalities Act. A clear and obvious case. So can I urge the Prime Minister to stop this and to continue to allow online voting and the hybrid Parliament to resume?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I do think that the Right Honourable Gentleman needs to consider what is really going on throughout the country, where ordinary people are getting used to queuing for long periods of time to do their shopping or whatever it happens to be. I must say I do not think it unreasonable that we should ask parliamentarians to come back to this place and do their job for the people of this country. And I know it's difficult. I know it's difficult. I apologise. I apologise to colleagues for the inconvenience, and I apologise to all those who have particular difficulties because they are shielded or because they are elderly. And it's vital that they should. And the change we're making today is that they should be able to vote by proxy. They should be able to vote by proxy. But I have to say, Mr. Speaker, when the people of this country look at what we are doing, asking schools, he now says he supports going schools to go back. I mean, our policy is test, trace and isolate. His policy is agree, U-turn and then criticise, Mr. Speaker. But what I can tell him is that I do think the people of this country, on the whole, will want their parliamentarians to be back at work, doing their job, passing legislation on behalf of the people of this country. And that is what this government intends to do.
Jeremy Hunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the Prime Minister on hitting the 200,000 daily capacity target for testing, which puts us at the top of the European League table for testing. The Prime Minister rightly said he wanted a 24-hour turnaround for testing. Could he tell us how many of the tests are currently being turned around within 24 hours and whether he'd be willing to publish on a regular basis that number?
Yes. Prime Minister.
Can I congratulate my right honourable friend on the kind of detailed forensic question that we could have had earlier on. But the answer is that we already do 90% of tests turn around within 48 hours. Of the tests conducted at the 199 testing centres and as well as the mobile test centres, they're all done within 24 hours. And I can undertake to him now to get all tests turned around in 24 hours by the end of June, except for difficulties with postal tests or insuperable problems like that.
Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Watching events unfold across America in recent days and the actions and rhetoric from the American president have been distressing and deeply worrying. We cannot delude ourselves at believing that we are witnessing anything short of a dangerous slide into autocracy. It is in times like these when people look to those they elect for hope, for guidance, for leadership and for action. However, in the 7 days since George Floyd was murdered, the UK government has not even offered words. It has not expressed that pain. It has shuttered itself in the hope that no one would notice. The Prime Minister skirted over this earlier in Prime Minister's questions. So can I ask the Prime Minister, what representations has he made to his ally Donald Trump? And at the very least, Prime Minister, say it now, Black Lives Matter.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course Black Lives Matter, and I totally understand the anger, the grief that is felt not just in America but around the world and in our country as well. I totally understand that and I get that. And I also support, as I've said, the right to protest. The only point I would make to the House is that protests should be carried out lawfully, and in this country protests should be carried out in accordance with our rules on social distancing.
Ian Blackford.
Well, I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, that the Prime Minister didn't answer the question what representations has he made to his friend Donald Trump. Mr. Speaker, it is imperative that the UK is vocal on human rights, freedom to gather and protest, freedom of speech and upholding press freedom in other parts of the world. It would be nothing short of hypocrisy if we were to turn a blind eye to events unfolding in the US. However, actions speak louder than words, and the Prime Minister can shake his head. But the UK exports millions of pounds worth of riot control equipment to the US, including tear gas and rubber bullets. The Prime Minister must have seen how these weapons are used on American streets. With the government's own guidance warning against equipment being used in such way, will the Prime Minister urgently review such exports?
Minister. I'm happy to look into any complaints, but as he knows, all exports are conducted in accordance with the consolidated guidance, and the UK is possibly the most scrupulous country in that respect in the world.
Mr. Speaker, I have a number of businesses that serve the wedding market and would like to hold viewings to make bookings for the future. Church leaders of Loughborough have also contacted me about access to churches, both for services and to help tackle loneliness. Please could I ask that religious faiths be allowed to let people into their places of worship, observing social distancing within their premises, and wedding venues to be allowed to access for bookings? Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Well, yes, I very much understand the urgency that many people in this country feel about the need to reopen places of worship. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Local Government, Community and Local Government, is of course leading a task force on this very matter. It is a tough one. Every time you do something like this, you push up the risk of infection, you push up the risk to the R again. And I cannot, just to repeat what I was saying earlier on to the Leader of the Opposition, we are not there yet. We're getting there, but we are not yet there yet. It is vital that the people of this country understand the continued need to push down on that infection rate.
Lord Russell-Moyle.
Our firefighters have been assisting this COVID crisis. They've taken 12 additional areas of work supporting our NHS. And while they are busier than ever, they're about to face another round of devastating cuts. My local fire authority in East Sussex is planning to remove 10 fire trucks from the county and the loss of frontline firefighters. Is the Prime Minister planning to respond to the FBU, the Fire Brigade Union letter, sent to him on the 22nd of May, calling for a moratorium on cuts? Clapping on Thursdays is well and good, but will he put his money where his mouth is and ensure that no fire authority needs to cut frontline firefighters when they have been helping save our country?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I will certainly respond to his letter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Prime Minister agree that as we exit the pandemic, it's critical that we not only stimulate the UK economy, but also we start the important process of levelling up? This should include stimulating the housing market to help excellent companies like PWS at Newton Aycliffe, investing in rural broadband to help villages like Killarby, and maybe moving the Treasury to Sedgefield. The acceleration of rolling stock investment to help companies like Hitachi. Can I also ask him to join me in opening the station at Ferryhill that I'm sure he's going to ask the Transport Secretary to approve?
Minister.
Well, a brilliant idea there. I think Sedgefield should be careful what it wishes for. But I will certainly investigate that possibility. But when you look at what we're doing, my honourable friend will know whether it's 300,000 homes that we want to build every year, massive investment in gigabit broadband, huge investment in railways and roads. I will make sure that I add to that an ambition to come and see Ferryhill Station launched with him.
Alan Whitehead.
Will the Prime Minister address himself to the question of quarantine arrangements? Most European countries have had quarantine arrangements for quite a while now and are beginning to reduce them. This country has had no quarantine arrangements to date and is only now introducing them. Why is that?
Prime Minister.
For the simple reason that as we get the rate of infection down with the efforts that we are making as a country, it is vital that we avoid reinfection from elsewhere, and that's why we're doing it.
Bill Stride.
Mr. Speaker, when my right honourable friend attended the liaison committee last week, he very kindly committed to me to speak to the Chancellor about the possibility of including self-employment income received by way of dividend in the calculation of furlough support. And I wonder whether my right honourable friend had had the opportunity to have that conversation, whether he had some good news for the House, because there are hundreds and thousands of self-employed people up and down this country who need that support.
Prime Minister.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. He raises a very, very important point, and I have an answer of fantastic complexity here before me. But the gist of it is that at present HMRC would be forced to rely on all sorts of information that they would not be able themselves to verify very easily in order to comply with his wishes. But I'm happy to discuss it more fully with him and to write to him in detail.
Bob Longfield.
In front of the liaison committee last week, the Prime Minister was clearly shocked to learn that many migrants living and working lawfully in the UK have no recourse to public funds. Without support, many have been forced to continue working in unsafe conditions or have been pushed into extreme poverty. He promised the liaison committee that he would do all he could to help. Scrapping the policy would be the best step. So can he update the House on his progress?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. What I can tell is that everybody knows that no recourse to public funds is a long-standing condition that applies to people here with temporary immigration status. But that doesn't. It's a term of art. It doesn't mean that they are necessarily excluded from all public funds. And for instance, they may be eligible for coronavirus job retention scheme funds, self-employed income support scheme funds, and indeed, if they've paid in to the benefit system, they may be eligible also for certain benefits.
Mark Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we come out of lockdown, it is vital that we get our economy firing on all cylinders. In Bolsover, to level up, we need more skilled jobs. So will my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, meet with me to discuss my proposal for Bolsover to lead the country with a green enterprise zone so that we can bring low-carbon manufacturing and research to our region?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, he has exactly the right vision for Bolsover, and it is indeed the vision that I have for the whole country. The green recovery is going to be essential to this country's success in the next few years. I'm happy to meet with him to discuss it.
Judith Cummins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Community Secretary has admitted unlawfully overruling his own planning inspector to allow the West Ferry development to go ahead, potentially saving the developer, Richard Desmond, who is a Conservative Party donor, £40 million in tax. He did this just weeks after sitting next to the developer at a Tory fundraising dinner. Given that this was the same scheme that the Prime Minister tried to push through when he was Mayor of London, that reappeared after he entered Downing Street, will he now tell the House what conversations he has had with the Secretary of State about the scheme, and will he publish all relevant correspondence between Number 10 and the departments?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to tell the honourable lady that I've had no conversations on that matter whatever, nor any exchanges of any kind.
Laura Trott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The lockdown has seen a rise in antisocial behaviour in my area, including at Lullingstone Castle, where a man sadly died last Thursday evening. My sincere condolences are with his family and friends at this time. This incident shows the need for more visible police in Sevenoaks. Can the Prime Minister confirm that the 147 new police officers promised to Kent will not be delayed, and they will be focused on front-line policing to tackle antisocial behaviour?
Prime Minister, will that be...
Yes, indeed, Mr. Speaker, and that's why this government is going to get on with its agenda of uniting and levelling up the 20,000 more police officers. In fact, we've recruited thousands already, and I'm pleased to say that the 147 that she identifies coming to Kent, if they haven't actually already got there, I think they've already got there, but if they haven't got there, they're getting there very shortly.
Maria Eagle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In view of the Health Secretary admitting yesterday that COVID outbreaks are worse in deprived areas and that our great cities have been hardest hit, and the PM's just said he takes these inequalities very seriously earlier in the session, can he now promise me that Liverpool City Council and Knowsley Borough Council will get the full cost of their COVID spend reimbursed, as they were told they would, instead of only half of it, which is what they've been allocated? I raised it with him on the 11th of May, and he promised he'd look into it. I have written to him, but I haven't had a reply.
Minister.
She has raised it before. I pointed out that we've given an extra £3.2 billion to local government, another £600 million to help them deal with the particular costs of care homes, but I'm happy to write back to her about the particular needs of Liverpool and Knowsley Council.
Bob Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Buckinghamshire Council has been able to help thousands of local businesses thanks to the £91 million grant from the Business Department. But despite the very best efforts of its staff, 13 million remains unclaimed. I and the Council would like all of that money to be able to be given to small businesses that need it to survive, but at the minute that's not allowed. Will my right honourable friend seek to persuade his Cabinet colleagues that this would be a win-win? More help for businesses in need without costing the government a penny more than has already been allocated.
We are certainly talking to all councils. I'm grateful to him, and he represents his businesses well in Aylesbury. We're talking to all councils about how they can properly utilise the allocations that they have.
Ben Bradshaw.
The Public Health Minister told me in an email on May the 22nd that the justification for a 14-day quarantine is, and I quote, where local COVID incidence and prevalence is much lower relative to international incidence and prevalence. It's not, is it? So why is he inflicting, from Monday, a blanket quarantine with no basis in science that will devastate our travel industry and rob British families of their foreign holidays?
I'm surprised to hear that criticism from the Labour benches. I thought that the opposition was in favour of looking at the quarantine policy, but the simple reason is to protect, the answer is to protect the British people from the re-importing of that disease once we have driven infection rates down.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Aviation was one of the first sectors to take an immediate negative impact from the coronavirus pandemic and will probably be one of the slowest to recover. Will my right honourable friend consider an extension to the furlough for air industry employees through the low season and into 2021?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to make a commitment, alas, to extend the coronavirus job retention scheme now, but we will certainly, but he represents the aviation sector, which has been very, very hard hit, and we will look at all the ways we can to support it throughout the crisis.
Flora Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope that the Prime Minister will join me in standing together not only at grief at the killing of George Floyd, but also determination that we will work together against racism, both in the US and here in the UK. In Putney, black teachers have told me they're scared of going back to school because of the higher rates of death. And also today's figures from the Metropolitan Police show that more than a quarter of lockdown fines have been for black people, although they are an eighth of our London population. Will the Prime Minister condemn the actions of the American police? Will he freeze the sales of tear gas and rubber bullets? Will he review the lockdown fines? And will he act on the report into COVID deaths so that there aren't more black people dying than white?
Sorry, we're not going to get other people in. We've got to be fair to each other. Prime Minister.
Okay, well, she raises a very important series of points. I certainly condemn the killing of George Floyd, and we will certainly make sure that everything that we export to any country around the world is in accordance with the consolidated guidance on human rights.
Laura Farris.
This government has taken the lead on tackling domestic abuse, but there is an ugly dimension that remains unresolved, where men who kill their partners in appalling acts of sexual violence establish in court that she asked for it and avoid a murder conviction. Does my right honourable friend agree that the time is now to end the rough sex defence?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
Yeah, she raises, I thank my honourable friend, she raises an incredibly important point, and we are committed to ensuring that the law is made clear on this point, and that defence is inexcusable.
Tim Farrell.
Mr. Speaker, the virus effectively turned summer into winter for Cumbrian tourism. Ending government funding in October, though, will mean 3 winters in a row, causing severe hardship on top of the already 312% increase we've had in unemployment locally. So will the Prime Minister provide a support package for tourism and hospitality in the lakes, the dales and elsewhere to see them through to the spring of 2021?
Minister.
I'm grateful to the honourable member. We're certainly looking at all sorts of packages to help the tourism industry, creative ideas to help the tourism industry over the winter period, so that their winter, as it were, can continue to be a kind of summer once we can get things open again. But there are all sorts of packages that we'll be bringing forward, but I don't want to extend some of the schemes that we currently have.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud to tell you that we have 2,500 world-class steelworkers in Scunthorpe. And like steelmakers across this land, they stand ready to make steel for HS2. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has said in this House that he wants to see that happen. Can he reassure me that he will press for HS2 to sign the UK Steel Charter and that steel for HS2 will be made in Britain?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are doing everything we can to support the UK steel industry and to make sure that as HS2 goes forward that it maximises the use of UK steel, and I'm proud to say that 98% of the companies that have signed up to deliver for HS2 are based in this country.
Andy Slaughter.
Speaker, when the Prime Minister was forced to publish the review of the risk COVID-19 poses to black and minority ethnic groups yesterday, why did he remove reference to the 1,000 responses to the review, many of which cited structural racism and discrimination as root causes of higher risk? If, unlike Trump, he seeks to represent the whole country he's elected to lead, what action is he going to take to show that in tackling COVID-19 and wider racism in society, Black Lives Matter?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Honourable Gentleman may have missed some of the earlier answers I've given, but he's wrong when he says that this government was somehow forced to publish a review. This government commissioned the review because we take it incredibly seriously. It's our review. And yes, I do think it intolerable that COVID falls in such a discriminatory way on different groups and different communities in our country. And that's why we are going to ensure that our Minister for Equalities takes up that report and sees what practical steps we need to take to protect those minorities.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend has rightly been focusing on keeping people safe, but that task goes beyond COVID-19. So can my right honourable friend give me the reassurance that as from the 1st of January 2021, the UK will have access to the quantity and quality of data it currently has through PRUM, passenger name records, ECRIS and SIS2, none of which, I believe, should require the ECJ jurisdiction in the UK?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, that depends, I'm afraid, on the outcome of our negotiations, as she knows well, but I'm absolutely confident that our friends and partners will see sense and the great mutual benefit in continuing to collaborate in exactly the way that we do.
We now come to the end. In order to allow safe exit, honourable members participating in the item of business and safe arrival of those participating in the next, I am now suspending the House for 5 minutes. We now come to the urgent question to ask on the impact of aviation. I understand that it will be Minister Colin Tolhurst. Hugh Merriman.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As it appears on the order paper, to ask the Chancellor of the Exchequer if he will make a statement on COVID-19 and the economic impact on aviation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend, the Chancellor, has asked me to respond on his behalf. The COVID-19 crisis has affected every person in the country and every sector of the UK economy, and aviation is essential to that economy. It connects the regions together and it plays a huge part in the UK's future as a global trading nation. That is why the government has responded to the crisis with an unprecedented package of measures. On the 24th of March, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, wrote to the aviation sector setting out the schemes being made available, including the deferral of VAT payments and the COVID Commercial Finance Facility and the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme. The Civil Aviation Authority is also working with airlines, airports and ground handlers to provide appropriate flexibility within the regulatory framework. If airlines and airports or other aviation organisations find themselves in trouble because of coronavirus and have exhausted the measures already available to them, the government has been clear that it is prepared to enter into discussions with individual companies seeking bespoke support. We recognise that there remain serious challenges for the aviation sector despite the measures that have been put in place. It will take time for passenger numbers to recover, and the impact will be felt first and foremost by the sector's employees. The recent announcements about redundancies from companies such as British Airways, Virgin and EasyJet will be very distressing news for employees and their families. These are commercial decisions, and they are decisions which I regret, particularly those companies benefiting from the Job Retention Scheme. The scheme was not designed for taxpayers to fund the wages of employees, only for those companies to put the same staff on notice of redundancy during the furlough period. The government stands ready to support anyone affected with the Department of Work and Pensions, there to help employees identify and access the support that is available. But my department has set up a Restart and Recovery and Engagement Unit to work with the aviation industry on the immediate issues affecting the restart of the sector and its longer-term growth and recovery. As part of this, we have established an Aviation Restart and Recovery Expert Steering Group. The group is formed of representatives from across the sector, including airports, airlines and ground handlers, industry bodies and unions. Mr. Speaker, the sustainable recovery of the aviation sector is a core part of our commitment to global connectivity and growing the UK economy. With airports, airlines and other parts of the aviation sector, we are putting in place the building blocks for recovery. The House will be updated as soon as possible on the next steps.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for giving aviation workers in your constituency and across the nation the chance to have their voice heard. And thank you, Minister, for being a tireless champion in the sector. This is a hugely challenging time for the aviation economy. Job losses are inevitable, but many of us are concerned that companies are using this pandemic as a justification to slash jobs and employment terms. Step forward, British Airways, the only airline who is effectively sacking its entire 42,000 workforce and replacing it with 30,000 jobs on inferior terms. BA have tried this before, but its workforce resisted. It's ethically outrageous that our national flag carrier is doing this at a time when the nation is at its weakest and when we expect the country to do its bit. So can I ask the government to use its full weight to stop unscrupulous employers from using this pandemic as a chance to slash terms and conditions? Will the department ask the Civil Aviation Authority to undertake an urgent review into reallocating lucrative landing slots at Heathrow from companies like British Airways, who indicate they are downsizing, and perhaps hand those to those companies that wish to expand and take on workers? BA have 51% of Heathrow landing slots, including the most profitable to JFK. And will the government change the job retention scheme to stop employers using the scheme while simultaneously putting those same employers on redundancy notice? On quarantine, Mr. Speaker,
This is the wrong policy at the worst possible time for the aviation sector and the economy. It gives companies like BA justification for shedding staff and worsening terms and conditions. 13 of our 15 most popular destinations internationally have a lower R rate than our own. Will the government commit to reviewing quarantine, bringing in air bridges from safer destinations and developing an immediate exit strategy to allow the aviation sector to plan ahead? Mr. Speaker, the situation is grave, but there is still time to save the aviation sector with further government support and action to ensure companies like British Airways do their patriotic duty, stand by their hard-working and loyal staff rather than deserting them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank my honourable friend for his work as chair of the Transport Select Committee and the fair but firm way in which he is standing up for the aviation sector. He asked about the government's ability to stop employers from making poor use of the job retention, this pandemic, in order to slash the terms and conditions. And I would like to say that I certainly would not certainly expect employers not to use the pandemic as a chance to slash terms and conditions. As I think most people would, terms and conditions are usually a matter for employees and employers. But employees obviously have recourse to a number of the options for support in cases where this is happening. But I would like to highlight that in matters of crisis like this, you would hope that all organisations who are taking these measures with their workforce would treat their employees with the social responsibility that you would expect them to have for the workers within their organisations. And I will be doing everything I can in my power in order to make sure that that is understood by those organisations. He also asked about the ability to look at the and reorganise the slots process. He's absolutely right to raise this point, and government currently is legally prevented from intervening in the slots allocation process. However, we want airport landing and take-off slots to be used as effectively as possible for UK consumers. As the UK aviation market recovers from the impacts of this terrible disease, I want to ensure the slots allocation process encourages competition and provides connectivity. So this is something that I will be looking at. I also understand that the Prime Minister has been clear, and I will be clear again today, that the job retention scheme was not designed for this purpose. It will be for Treasury to review the specifics of the scheme, and I'm sure that colleagues will be taking note of today's proceedings. The Home Secretary later will be making a statement on the quarantine measures immediately after me, and I do not want to preempt her. But I can confirm that the measures will be subject to regular review. My department, through the Aviation Restart and Recovery Unit, is working non-stop with the sector and government partners to plan for future of aviation, enabling it to recover. No option is off the table, and we are looking very closely at air bridges, which are also known as international corridors. And just to add, Mr. Speaker, I will be working tireless, as I have done over the last 10 weeks, to do whatever I can to mitigate the impacts that have been felt by the aviation sector.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I congratulate the Chair of the Select Committee on securing this urgent question. The aviation industry is looking to the Chancellor for leadership, but he's not here today, and they've been locked in a holding pattern once again. While the Treasury dithers and delays, the crisis continues to unfold. 12,000 job losses at BA, a quarter of its workforce, 4,500 redundancies at EasyJet, 3,000 staff at threat of redundancy at Virgin Atlantic. GE making a quarter of its global workforce redundant with jobs at risk in South Wales. Airbus describing this as the biggest crisis in their history. So where is the urgency and the clarity and the specific support package the Chancellor referred to back in March? This is a sector that contributes £22 billion a year to our economy. 230,000 jobs across the industry and the manufacturing supply chain are dependent on it. It needs to change to meet the challenge of climate change. So why did one industry leader tell the Transport Select Committee just a fortnight ago that the government was, and I quote, asleep at the wheel? Can the Minister maybe go back and wake the Treasury up? We've been calling for an aviation sector deal. Can we have one? If so, by when? British Airways has taken taxpayer cash to furlough their staff as As we've heard, why is anyone surprised by this? We warned the government this would happen. So will the government now ensure that any bailouts come with conditions to protect jobs and workers' rights and taxpayers' money? Will the government ensure that any company in receipt of support from British taxpayers also has its tax base here in the UK? Will the government hold them to tougher environmental targets to achieve our net zero ambition, rather than simply allowing them to go bust through government inaction and incompetence? Finally, Mr. Speaker, we have the Home Secretary ambling along this afternoon with a face-saving quarantine plan with huge consequences for our economy and without any publication of any evidence to support it on public health grounds. None of this is good enough. This is an issue for our whole economy. So with respect to the Minister, her department is neither use nor ornament. We need the Treasury to act. The Chancellor should be here. They should have turned up this afternoon, and I hope she'll take that message back in the strongest possible terms.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to say to the honourable gentleman, and well, actually, first of all, I'd like to welcome to his place because and his appointment as shadow. Obviously today I have taken the urgent question as the Minister responsible for aviation and as the Minister who has been working with the sector over the last 10 weeks in order to understand the impacts and the issues that are related to the airlines and our airports and our whole aviation sector. We cannot underestimate that the impact of coronavirus has had on the whole of the UK economy, and absolutely the aviation sector has been acutely affected by that. And we have been working hard within government, and I think that is it's pretty clear for most people to see the unprecedented level of support that the Chancellor and this government has delivered to across the economy and has had a massive impact within the aviation sector. The Chancellor was incredibly clear that any business that had explored all the government schemes and had that need for bespoke as a last resort, bespoke support, had the opportunity to enter into discussions with the government. And it is absolutely right that we would request all of those private businesses to exhaust all other options before that, including raising capital from existing investors and exhausting all the economy-wide measures that have been put. The furlough, the job retention scheme has made a massive impact in the aviation sector in order to keep those people employed. And I have already outlined in my opener to the urgent question that I will do whatever I can as aviation minister in order to encourage those companies to use the furlough, make use of those government schemes without making people redundant. We have not been asleep at the wheel. Absolutely not, and I'm not sure that's something that everybody else recognises. But a bailout by the taxpayer, of course, and any kind of government support would include obligations, making sure that it's compliant with state aid, and we meet our legal obligations, particularly with climate change. In regards to quarantine, the Prime Minister, before in PMQs, made it very, very clear we need to keep this infection under control, and therefore the Home Secretary is bringing forward measures in order to try and mitigate that.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I refer the House to my entry in the Members' Register. Aviation supports 1 million jobs in the UK, 114,000 in aerospace, 1,700 for my constituents. International air travel is necessary for trade. Without it, there is no global Britain. So instead of bringing in measures to close Britain off from the rest of the world, why is the government not taking a lead in developing an international aviation health screening standard to save jobs and ensure Britain is open for business?
Well, I thank my right honourable friend, and I recognise the importance of the aviation sector, particularly within her constituency. And I would just like to outline that we have set up the Restart and Recovery unit within the department, which is very much working across government with the sector, with the airlines, airports and the ground handlers and our international trade bodies, and looking at how we are able to get exactly that, some international agreed standard health measures. We're working incredibly hard in order to gain consumer confidence so that people want to travel again, but also being able to get those measures in place in order that we can also absolutely meet our objective to keeping people safe and reducing the spread of coronavirus, but also trying to get the aviation sector up and running as quickly as we possibly can.
Come to Gavin Newlands, the SNP spokesperson, with 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Back in March, the Chancellor said he was working on a specific package of help for airports and airlines. We're still waiting on that support. So will she press the Chancellor to at least follow the Scottish Government's lead in giving the industry 100% business rates relief for a year? And echo what's been said by the committee chair on the despicable behaviour of Willie Walsh and IAG. In the short term, I think we all understand and accept that the industry may need to reduce in size, but the manner in which Mr Walsh is choosing to do this should be illegal if it is not already. However, this affects the supply chain too, and sadly, Rolls-Royce has today confirmed that they intend to cut 700 jobs at Shannon in my constituency. The company is looking to offshore yet more work, and despite taking UK Government R&D money along with job retention scheme money, the UK, but in particular in Shannon, is being disproportionately affected. So can I ask her, is the Government engaged with or offered any support to Rolls-Royce to mitigate job losses? And finally, Mr Speaker, will she join me in urging Rolls-Royce to engage meaningfully with the Scottish Government on supporting jobs at Shannon?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And the honourable gentleman has obviously raised a number of these points with me previously. And as I've tried to articulate to him, that the support that is being offered to the aviation sector, that ability in order for them to look at and all the government schemes, exhaust all other possibilities and going to shareholders to see whether or not that they can support their businesses, and then their ability then to come to the government to have those discussions around bespoke support. And as he would imagine, those discussions are ongoing. In regards to business rates, he's mentioned this before, quite rightly. This is a matter, the Chancellor was clear about where those business rate alleviations would happen, and that is obviously a matter for the Treasury. In regards to the wider impacts in relation to the reduction in aviation and the impact that it will have on the wider jobs market within the aerospace industry, and particular impact within Rolls-Royce. As I've already outlined, the furlough scheme was not intended in order for businesses to put people on redundancy whilst they were on furlough. However, we will, of course, as you would expect, work across government and my colleagues in BAYS in order to assess the significant impact that it will be felt across the economy, but particularly to the wider aerospace sector, and do whatever we can in order to make sure that we engage with those businesses to protect as many jobs as possible.
Sir Graham Brady.
Okay, can I tell the Minister that the Manchester Airport generates 100,000 jobs and is an essential motor for growth across the north of England as well? And if we're going to save those jobs, then it's essential, first of all, that companies behave responsibly, but secondly, that government should partner with the sector to make sure that the vital peak summer season goes ahead. And if that is going to happen, we need immediate clarity about the criteria for safe countries and for the names of those countries that will be the air bridges put in place rapidly.
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and my right honourable friend, and he's quite right. And as aviation minister and across government, we are working with the sector at pace, with officials and representatives, in order to get those measures in place so people can indeed get back into the air and travel as soon as possible. However, I must caveat that with the point that ultimately the limiting the spread of coronavirus and keeping the UK population safe has got to be our priority, but I am determined and will work hard to find a solution.
Johnson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. British Airways, as we've already heard, has taken public money from the government's coronavirus job retention scheme, intended to protect workers' jobs, but instead has used this to pay for 12,000 workers on their redundancy notice period. The purpose of the scheme was to keep people in work, not to let them go on the cheap. Will the Minister join me in condemning this behaviour, and will he/she ensure that any further support protects the workforce as intended? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Shareholders and the employers should consider their social responsibility to the people within their business, and they should take the benefits in the good times, and they should share the burden when the times are harder, particularly when they're in receipt of taxpayer monies. Therefore, I will do, and I've already reiterated, Mr. Speaker, I will do all I can to make sure that is understood by those organisations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will be aware of how important the airline sector is to connecting Scotland, not just with the rest of the United Kingdom, but the whole of the world. With airlines under pressure and flight paths being reduced, there is real concern in Scotland that Scotland might lose out. So can she reassure me that the Government will do everything it can do to protect Scotland's air connections, not just with the rest of the UK, but across the world?
I thank my honourable friend. He's absolutely right. Air connectivity with all of our devolved administrations, particularly Scotland, are particularly important, and very much regional connectivity, our smaller airports and those routes will feature in our planning for the recovery stage. I'm incredibly cognisant of the fact that we have got a lot to work to do in order to keep that there and deliver on our levelling up agenda, and that's exactly what I'm intending to do.
Number 8 not here, so we'll go to number 9, Dr. Band Spencer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Minister for her answers, and I echo the point around use of taxpayers' money and the furlough scheme and corporate responsibility for carriers such as British Airways. A 14-day quarantine will ground the aviation industry and all the jobs and businesses that rely on it, and as yet we have not provided aviation-specific financial support. But given that the 14-day quarantine is in effect a government-mandated shutdown of a large part of the passenger airline industry, would the Minister agree with me that sector-specific financial support should be provided, as we have with other sectors directly shut down, such as shops and pubs?
Well, again, I thank my honourable friend, and I do recognise the importance of the aviation sector within his constituency, and I know he's been a champion and spoken to me a number of times on this issue already. Absolutely, we have delivered unprecedented financial support already for these airlines, but with the ability to access those government schemes. As we move through the period of restart and recovery, we are working with the industry in order to assess what the problems and the issues and the requirements will be. And we haven't taken anything off the table, but we will continue to work through that. And obviously, we are working very closely with the sector in order to deliver the quarantine announcements.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is probably worth repeating. British Airways, which has benefited from COVID-19 taxpayer support, has issued redundancy notices to its entire 42,000 strong workforce, and shamelessly intends to make 12,000 redundant and rehire the remainder on much worse contracts. So British Airways has taken hundreds of millions of pounds of government money intended to protect workers' jobs. In the words of the many British Airways employees in my Leicester East constituency who are fearing for their futures, this is immoral, opportunistic and greedy. Did the government not agree conditions? Does the government plan to stand up to this corporate bully? And will they say now, how will they guarantee protections for workers?
I feel the concerns of BA workers and others, and I want to make the point that the government schemes, we want to make the point to these organisations that the use of government schemes is preferable to making redundancies. Terms and conditions are a matter for negotiation between employers and employees, and government's not part of that. But I have already stated that we would expect employers to treat employees fairly and in the spirit of partnership.
Ruth Capri.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Up to 1 in 3 households in Hounslow Borough could be affected by job losses at Heathrow. So, will the government work with aviation communities and their councils, and also with aviation unions, to deal with the economic and the social impact of the decimation of the aviation sector on our communities?
Minister.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for raising that point, because it's quite right, and we, Department of Work and Pensions, stand ready to support anyone that is affected with those announcements and those job losses. And I myself, as the aviation sector a minister, has said that I am quite keen to work where we can regionally, where there are particular areas that may or may not be affected disproportionately by the loss of these jobs.
Steve Double.
Mr. Speaker, without airports there can be no aviation sector, and many of our smaller regional airports like Cornwall Airport, Newquay, have been very deeply impacted by this crisis, and there's great concern about their future. These airports are going to be vital in the recovery of the aviation sector and indeed the wider economy. So can the Minister say what steps she's taking to support our regional airports?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, and he's quite right. The regional airports, our smaller airports throughout the UK, will and have been affected by coronavirus. I have given my assurances to those smaller airports that we will work with them on the recovery stage in order to secure our connectivity. They are important pieces of infrastructure, and I am very cognizant of the fact that once those important pieces of infrastructure are closed or lost, it's harder to reinvigorate them. So I'll be working my hardest to try and protect that.
Liz Twist.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My many constituents who are employed by British Airways are absolutely devastated by the threat of losing their jobs and the proposed downgrading of their terms and conditions of employment. And this is a message that BA needs to hear loud and clear from this House, I think. So I'm glad to hear that she shares the concern of so many members of these proposals, but will she go further and now condemn this behaviour and make it a condition of any financial or business support that they reverse this decision?
I've been clear to the Honourable Lady on my position on that particular point, but I think we also do need to recognise that coronavirus has had an unprecedented impact on all businesses, and airlines are not immune from some of the financial challenges that other parts of the economy are faced with. However, we absolutely stand by the point that this was not the intention of the jobs retention scheme, and I think I've already made the point.
Morris.
Does my right honourable friend agree that if British Airways want to continue to treat their employees with contempt by refusing to take Section 188 off the table and refusing to move the deadline past June 15th, will the government consider speaking to the Aviation Authority to encourage them to remove their legacy slots, their legacy landing slots, as leverage for making sure that they treat their employees with the respect they deserve?
I agree with my honourable friend that, and as I've already outlined, in the good times, businesses get the benefits from being shareholders, and actually they should be spreading that burden in the bad times. And ultimately, it is workers that make any business and really dictate the success of any of those businesses. I've already outlined that there are opportunities moving forward as we work through coronavirus and move to the end of December, and I'm quite willing to look at anything that can benefit and open up and increase the competition within our aviation sector.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
In her response to the Honourable Member for Leicester East, the Minister said that she wanted to make the point to BA that the job retention scheme was not to be used for redundancies. Can I ask her to confirm specifically what engagement has the government had with British Airways? It's at least 3 weeks since I was first contacted by constituents who are appalled by the way they are being treated after a lifetime of loyal service. What has the government actually done to date to engage with BA on this point?
Well, the Honourable Lady will accept that I've been engaging regularly throughout the last 10 weeks with the whole of the aviation sector, and also BA as an organisation and other organisations that have had made similar announcements. I will continue to do that, and I'd just like to highlight that debates like this will make the point very clearly as well to those organisations. And as I've said before, organisations taking these decisions ultimately need customers, and if customers view that their actions are below par, then actually people, when booking flights, may be thinking with their feet.
Mr. Wakefield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I start by thanking the Honourable Member for Bexhill and Battle for securing this urgent question. As an MP for Greater Manchester, I'm particularly concerned about Manchester Airport and the wider impact on the North West aerospace and aviation industry. Can my honourable friend advise what assessment has been done by herself and her department on the employment sectors for the sector itself and the wider supply chain?
Well, I thank my honourable friend and note the importance of Manchester Airport close to his constituency and the work that they do there. And we've been engaging with them extensively over the last 10 weeks. As you would expect, we are working across government through a government-led task force in regards to aviation, working with my colleagues in Bays, looking at the extent of the impact on jobs and the sector from the wider, wider than just airlines and airports, and that work is ongoing and obviously will be very much influencing policy.
We now come to Maria Riedel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Liverpool John Lennon Airport in my constituency supports 7,000 jobs, contributes £240 million in gross value added to the local economy, but saw no international flights at all from mid-April to mid-May. The chaotic and strangely timed government quarantine plan will prevent any early recovery and cost the aviation industry generally even more. In view of this, what specific support will she offer to the aviation industry generally and to regional airports in particular in exchange for this sudden imposition of a government policy?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our priority is clear. It has been to halt and limit the spread of the coronavirus. I am working with our officials, our department are working with the sector in order to gain a set of standard health measures that can be applied across the industry, which will be internationally recognised. We are working with the sector in order to find ways in which we can allow people to travel safely and come into the country without the need for quarantine. But ultimately, it is absolutely the right time to implement quarantining, as we are seeing a reduced number of transmission, and we want to protect the UK and the people within it.
William Marson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents in Hertford and Stortford, who are employed by British Airways at Stansted Airport, are desperately worried for their jobs. Will my right honourable friend join me in supporting them, condemning BA, urging BA, a profitable, cash-rich company who has availed themselves of government support in this crisis and in the context of Project Birch, to engage with the government, unions and staff and not to destroy my constituents' jobs?
I thank my honourable friend, and like her, I too have British Airways employees within my constituency, and I understand the pain and the worry that it is causing those individuals. There is so much concern amongst the whole of the UK population and what that means for them economically. I've made the point that this is not what we would expect. But quite right, we are not part of those discussions that are ongoing, but I will monitor them. I will continue to talk to the unions. I will continue to talk to those businesses in order to limit the number of jobs that are lost.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've had scores of emails from people representing years and years of loyal service to British Airways, who initially welcomed these lefty-looking furlough and job retention schemes and are now finding that the public purse is being used to effectively chuck them on the scrap heap. So, can I ask the Minister to revive another old Labour tradition and, rather than acting a bit like a bystander, to bang some heads together and get unions, airlines and the government round the table? They can have beer and sandwiches at number 10 if they like, and thrash out a sector-specific deal to save aviation in this country.
Minister.
Well, I like the honourable lady's optimism for beer and sandwiches. I don't drink beer personally, so it wouldn't necessarily be a benefit for me. Wine is more my taste, but I should say that we remain committed as government in order to do what we need to do and align the policies in order to get people up, planes up in the air. Aviation sector is so important for the UK economy. It will remain important for the UK economy, particularly with our regional connectivity, and we will work through this crisis with the mind of the aviation sector and what we can do and how we can mitigate the impact of that.
Mark Pritchard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Minister if she'll continue to press the Home Office on introducing a flexible quarantine rather than a blanket quarantine, so that countries with high infection rates can be targeted rather than every country, including those with low infection rates? And while she has the opportunity, given that some extensions have been given to review periods, could she give a commitment to the House today that any review post 8th of June, 29th of June, will be 3 weeks and 3 weeks only, and not expanded or extended to a 4-week period or further?
I thank my honourable friend, and he's right that any quarantine review period needs to be understood by the sector. As I have already outlined, we are working with the sector in order to, and we are investigating at air bridges. There's a lot of work going on internationally as well with our international organisations, quite rightly, because this is not something that just purely affects the UK. In relation to quarantine, there are a number of countries that are following suit and or have already implemented measures of this time. The Home Secretary will be immediately after me making a statement in relation to the policy, and obviously I won't want to preempt anything that she might say.
Much, Mr. Speaker. It's quite clear from the kind of callous and cavalier attitude of Willie Walsh that he only understands one piece of language. So can I gently suggest to the Minister this definitely needs to be escalated? When will the Prime Minister be picking up the phone to Willie Walsh and making it crystal clear to BA that unless they halt these plans, those much coveted slots at Heathrow will go? We need much stronger language from the government on this, because many of my constituents, frankly, are cheesed off by this.
Well, I accept that constituents will be concerned and upset. That's absolutely a completely understandable position. I've already tried to outline that I will do what I can in my capacity as Aviation Minister to mitigate or limit the number of job losses. We haven't stopped working. I haven't stopped working on that. The Prime Minister also was clear that this was not the in the spirit of the furlough scheme, and we will keep working on that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The slowdown in the aviation sector is having a big impact on jobs in my own constituency. Airbus, Rolls-Royce and GKN employ several thousand people. So does my honourable friend agree that we must get the aviation sector working again quickly, not only to protect jobs, but to preserve our country's world-leading industrial manufacturing capability in civil aerospace and, crucially, in defence?
Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and he's absolutely right. The success of the aviation industry has a direct impact on some of the wider aviation manufacturing technology that is being developed in this country, and particularly it is affecting my constituency also. So he's absolutely right, and we will continue to work across government in order to understand the full impact that it has in the wider supply chain, and work in ways to mitigate that as far as we are able.
Siobhan MacDonald.
Mr. Speaker, Asda, Marks and Spencer's, B&Q, John Lewis, Sainsbury's.
The Minister and I have been here before. Employers choosing to reduce terms and conditions on its long-standing staff simply with 90 days' notice. Only BA is the employer that bears our country's name and holds our country's flag. Is this what we want for Britain in post-coronavirus times? We will not fight our way out of a depression by reducing people's pay.
The Honourable Lady is quite right. We have indeed had conversations in this vein many times before, and as I said in my opener, I regret the job announcements that the organisations have made. I think that we also need to accept that we are in unprecedented times, and we are working hard with the sector, with all stakeholders, and that's including unions and industry representatives and companies specifically, in order to fully understand what that will mean for the future and what we need to do in order to mitigate that. I've said a number of times today that on my position, and I will continue to work in order to try and limit those job losses.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Although the aviation industry will face significant challenges in the months and years ahead, regional airports across the UK will continue to be well placed to increase economic growth and boost connectivity in the longer term. Does my honourable friend agree with me that restoring commercial passenger flights from Blackpool Airport in the longer term could boost tourism, increase economic growth and really help to deliver the government's levelling up agenda?
My honourable friends are absolutely right. Regional airports can have such a major impact on the local communities in which they serve, and very much there is a pride in having an airport within your area, and they are absolutely part of our levelling up agenda and being able to increase and improve our UK's connectivity, not just within the UK but abroad, and absolutely that is part of our recovery and planning for the future.
McKinnell.
Speaker, and I echo concerns about the shoddy treatment of BA staff. Newcastle Airport's the single largest site employment in my constituency, supporting 4,000 jobs, 19,000 across the North East region. It's pivotal to our regional economy. Airports in Scotland and Northern Ireland have been granted business rates relief. In England and Wales, the government has offered that to retail, hospitality and leisure, but not aviation. She says business rates are not her department, but the Chancellor is not here. So can this government not see that this industry needs support now, but also for the future economic storms that are clearly going to come, that are going to impact areas, particularly like the North East?
I understand the impact that any reduction in jobs or the stress of organisations with her constituency will have on her constituency. We have, the Chancellor did announce an unprecedented level of support. That has been made use of. The option to come to us to talk to us about bespoke support has been there and is still there, and I'm continuing to talk to airports and airlines about the ability to tap into that. And we will continue to work with the sector in order to mitigate some of the issues and the impacts that they are quite understandably feeling at this moment in time.
27 withdrawn. We go to Zara Sultan.
Speaker, constituents of mine in Coventry South have told me that BA's plan means that they face redundancy, significantly reduced wages and worse working conditions. The company should step back from the brink and instead work with trade unions and the government to develop a strategy that protects jobs and the environment. So will the Minister commit to using the government's powers to prevent this betrayal of staff, such as withdrawing slots at airports and exploring the option to bring back the company under public control?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think I've outlined the point quite clearly. I've answered a number of questions in the same vein, and that is I will continue to do what I can in order to make organisations within the sector aware that we would rather than use the unprecedented government support that is available to them before making redundancies. I absolutely understand the concerns of the workers that are affected. And we will continue to look at all options that we have as a government to make use of.
Chris Grayling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I also represent a number of the British Airways employees affected, and I'm grateful to the Minister for her commitment to keep pressurising the airline to try to minimise the number of job cuts. And indeed, I'd encourage her to do that not simply for British Airways, but all the other airlines affected. But, Mr. Speaker, this sector is the busiest and biggest of its kind in Europe in normal times. It's crucial to our economy. Can I ask her to work with the Chancellor as he comes to his next financial statement during the course of this year to look at a longer-term recovery plan for the sector that goes beyond the immediate government support and actually sets a path that can put this sector back where it should be, which is at the top of the European league table?
Minister.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend, and he is absolutely right in the scale and the importance of the aviation sector in the UK compared to other parts of the world, and also the level of employment that creates within the UK. And I am committed, as the Secretary of State is, working with Treasury in order to, and across government, with all government departments, in order to find solutions to a sector which has been and has been affected badly, and obviously will maybe experience a slight lag in regards to the restart, just due to the nature of the work that they do. So I am committed to working with my colleagues across government to find solutions to those questions.
Number 30 not here. We'll go to Flick Drummond. Flick Drummond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank my honourable friend for her comments, particularly of BA, which is affecting a lot of my employees as well. Now, Southampton Airport is an important contributor to the economic prosperity of the wider region and has already seen the loss of Flybe, which was 95% of its business, so it's already struggling before COVID-19. What further steps can the government give to regional airports like Southampton, which are relied on by a wide range of companies, and it's a lifeline for business and other travel?
Well, I thank my honourable friend, and I know very well the impact of the coronavirus has on Southampton Airport, and they are a great asset on the south coast. We are engaged constantly with the airports, and I'm committed to doing that and having those conversations of what we can do to help those regional airports, and that will continue, so we fully understand their pressures, and where we can act, I will do my best to achieve that.
Session Lerman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 12th of May, I raised the worries of many of my constituents, some of whom had over 30 years of service with the Transport Secretary. One constituent highlighted to me that on his road alone there are 5 BA members of staff. And let's be clear, these are staff members who've given up birthdays, funerals to serve BA. They've made sacrifices. They fear losing everything when the sham of a consultation ends in 2 weeks. So will the government act urgently now to ensure supports are provided to those constituents and others?
As I thank the Honourable Lady, the Department of Work and Pensions are ready to stand ready to help and support anyone who's affected by this. I have to reiterate that terms and conditions are for negotiation between the employer, employee and or their representatives, and government aren't part of those discussions. If terms are not agreed to, there is still a matter. There are still options for recourse. I am monitoring the situation closely. I think there's many constituencies affected. We will keep an eye on what happens in relation to that particular point that she raises. But absolutely, I want all employees to be treated fairly and given the respect that they deserve for the contribution they've made for the businesses in which they've worked.
Jameson.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the Minister for confirming that the government would be willing to enter into bespoke agreements and arrangements with airlines. Given that British Airways in particular is ultimately a private company and thinks it can behave as disgracefully as it wants to, how does the government intend to mitigate that?
Well, as I have said, I, as the Aviation Minister, absolutely would expect that any organisation would be treating their employees fairly in the spirit of partnership, and absolutely it is a question for the organisations as to whether they feel that they're carrying out their social responsibility and acting in a good way. But absolutely, there are opportunities for us as we move forward. We have the Restart and Recovery project where we are working with the sector to find ways in which we can speed up the recovery within the aviation sector, and I'm sure that Treasury and across government we are looking at ways in which we can mitigate all of these things that colleagues quite rightly have raised here this morning.
We're a Hobhouse.
Mr. Speaker, now is the opportunity to move the aviation sector towards net zero. Government needs to require the gradual blending in of synthetic fuels, first for all international flights, for all internal flights, and then international flights via international agreements. There is a mechanism for doing this via the renewable transport fuel obligation. Will she commit towards this move towards a net zero aviation industry?
The Honourable Lady knows that obviously decarbonisation with the aviation sector is a very important priority for government and also the sector themselves. They've come together to work towards that, and I will commit as the Aviation Minister and the Department to working with the sector in order to reduce those emissions and decarbonise the industry as far as we're able.
Ian Paisley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I put on record a thanks to the Minister for the several meetings she's had with myself and colleagues over this crisis to deal with the airport situation in Northern Ireland, which has its own particular problems. I'm sure she agrees that the staff of British Airways who operate out of Northern Ireland, cabin crew, pilots and other staff, feel absolutely betrayed by the conduct of Willie Walsh and the organisation. They carry the strapline national carrier. It should be changed to national disgrace by the way they have operated. But the government can't have it both ways. The government can't close air traffic down, introduce a quarantine that will impact on airports and airlines, and then say this has nothing to do with us. Action has got to be taken to address this holistically, and I urge the Minister and the government to act.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his words, and particularly in regards to our regional connectivity and being able to continue that connectivity with Northern Ireland is a key priority, and it's been good to be able to continue to do that with government support. And we will continue, as I've outlined, to work together across government with the Aviation Task Force, working with sector, working with experts, working with our stakeholders in order to try and find solutions. The reality of it is there are, with regards to aviation, there has to be consumer confidence as well to travel, and we need to make sure that we are tackling consumer confidence but also creating the right environment with our policies in order for airlines to get back in the air, and I'm committed to working with all our colleagues across government as the Secretary of State is in order to deliver that.
Laura Farris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Section 188 of the Trade Union and Labour Relations Act does not just create a general duty to consult with employees, but a specific duty to consult on avoiding redundancies, reducing the numbers of those selected for redundancy and mitigating the consequences. Could my honourable friend commit to including an employment judge or an impartial employment lawyer onto the steering group to assess whether BA and other airlines are meaningfully engaging with their statutory obligations and make this a condition of further government support?
Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend. She makes a very good suggestion, and I happily take that away and see what I can do.
Sam Terry.
Thank you, Mr. I've had thousands of individually written emails, including residents in Ilford South who have collectively spent decades and decades working for British Airways. Unite the union members that have given their adult lives in making British Airways our proud national flag carrier. BA is a multi-billion-pound company, one that has £10.7 billion in liquid assets and other assets if you include its parent company, IAG. I would ask the Minister to seriously consider whether or not any mechanism can be brought forward by the government to look at the allocation of the slots, because without those slots, the most lucrative part of all of the operation of which BA makes its profits, IAG, Willie Walsh, and all of the people swinging the axe on all those tens of thousands of people. Remember, not only being sacked, all of them being sacked and then re-engaged, it might make them sit up and actually listen to how serious members are across this House, and if not, ask if they will return the British flag, because they don't deserve to carry it on their planes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I also want to thank the honourable gentleman for obviously his questioning of me on this particular point at the Transport Select Committee, and I recognise supporting very much his constituents. And the point that I will make is that this has been a commercial decision taken by British Airways. We would absolutely expect any organisation entering into this process that it would be done with fairness, in the right way for employees, and I will do my best to work with colleagues across the government in order to deliver the support that is needed for those people affected, and also to try our best to mitigate any particular job losses which are coming because of an unprecedented reduction of the number of flights travelling, and it's not something that is specific to the UK.
Much, Mr. Speaker. Murray is well served by Inverness Airport, and it has been operating with only essential flights during this pandemic. Can the Minister outline what support the Government have given and will continue to give to regional airports such as Inverness, who serve people in Murray and across the north of Scotland?
Well, thank my honourable friend. We will continue to work with our regional airports in order to understand the full impact that coronavirus is having on the operations of their businesses. As I've already outlined, regional connectivity is a priority for us within the department, and I will continue to work with those individual regional airports in order to deliver on what we can do. There are policy levers that are available to us, and we will be exploring that more within the Restart and Recovery Unit.
Russell Moore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I raise the particular issue with the Minister of the British Airways Avionics Engineering site in Llantriston to my honourable friend's constituency of Pontypridd, and I pay tribute to her for all the work she's doing in supporting the workforce there. Many of my constituents are facing this consultation now. It cannot be good enough for the Minister to simply say the DWP is ready to offer support if they lose their jobs. These are highly skilled, well-paid jobs in South Wales. It is worth £1 billion to the South Wales economy and more than £6 billion to the Welsh economy as a whole. I say to the Minister, and I don't doubt his sincerity, but her answers just aren't good enough. My constituents and constituents up and down the land are desperate for government intervention to support the aviation sector and all these jobs that many tens of thousands of constituents rely on.
Well, whilst the honourable gentleman knows I have great respect for him, but I will come back to him on the fact we are supporting the aviation sector. We have delivered unprecedented government support. Those organisations have the opportunity to support with us from a bespoke support. But he's absolutely right. You know, in regards to what we absolutely as government will try and deliver what we can in order to support those colleagues. But we also need to be asking those organisations how they will support those workers that are being affected by the commercial decisions that they are taking. And I will continue to do what I can in my capacity.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think much of the anger that's been expressed in this House during this debate has been because British Airways has taken advantage of a government scheme intended to protect jobs and used it as a convenient funding stream for a long-planned corporate restructuring. It's a breach of faith. Does my honourable friend agree that British Airways should pay a price for that breach of faith?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents have had to make huge sacrifices during this terrible outbreak, and they have responded with real solidarity, helping others and following the rules. Now those who work at the British Airways call centre in Newcastle see the contempt in which they are held, and they feel abandoned, betrayed, blackmailed. Does the Minister agree that just as with governments, businesses will be judged by their response to a crisis, and does she think British Airways' response is worthy of our national flag?
Well, I think the Honourable Lady is right. Businesses are judged in the way they behave and the way they treat their employees, and I think we will need to wait to see how British Airways is judged by the consumers and the customers they reach out to, and I will do whatever I can in order to work with those airlines to mitigate any job losses.
Come in, Holding Red.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can understand the public concern that's given rise to the policy on quarantining. Would it be worth publishing both the economic and the public health impacts of that policy, with and without air bridges, to properly inform the public debate?
Well, I thank my honourable friend, as he may know, that the Home Secretary is going to do a statement directly after this UQ, and I wouldn't want to preempt anything that she may incline to speak about. But it's absolutely right that at this particular time, as we see the reduction in the spread of domestic cases, that we do whatever we can to limit those imported cases. That is why the decision has been taken, and I've outlined that I'll be working hard with the sector and the team at DfT across government in order to find solutions to make sure that we can get airplanes in the air and passengers on their holidays as quickly as possible.
44 withdrawn, so we go to Dr. Andrew Morrison.
But the Minister must have made an economic assessment of the effects of quarantine. Does she accept that there is no point in quarantining people coming from countries with a relatively low disease burden to the UK? And if she does, which European countries specifically has she in mind for quarantine, since all of them, pretty much, have a lower disease burden than the United Kingdom?
Well, my honourable friends will know that in DfT we are working closely with our colleagues in the Home Office in regards to the implementation of the borders and quarantining policy in order, and particularly to make sure that we are expressing the concerns and the needs of the aviation sector and how that can be implemented practically. As he will know, that many countries across Europe and across the rest of the world are there's a number of differences in the implementation of the quarantining measures and other measures, and we will continue to keep working to do that in order to find solutions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And along with all the other members who have demonstrated so clearly today, I'm increasingly concerned by the actions and apparent decisions of British Airways and its management teams. Whilst these are difficult times for everyone, BA does have a duty to its employees, including all those who live in Newport West. And again, I pay tribute to my colleagues from the honourable members from South Wales for the work that they've been doing in this concerted effort in South Wales in particular. So what discussions has the Minister had with the relevant trade unions about the impact of the redundancies on people up and down the country?
So, I thank the Honourable Lady. So, my department and myself engages with unions in regards to the impact of jobs, and we've heard, and I've got some other meetings coming up with the unions. Absolutely, within the department, we have been very clear, and I would think the unions would say that we have been working with them over this period, and we are committed to doing that in order to deliver on behalf of workers as far as we can.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, British Airways is a private company, but the reality for many employees and customers is that it's a national institution. And the reality is that for many employees, perhaps they've shown more loyalty to British Airways because of that than a normal airline. But also customers. I think there's been occasions where I've actually paid more to fly with British Airways because I actually, as a British citizen, felt some loyalty towards it. Would the Minister take into account both the employees who've been most acutely affected, but also us as national citizens who have shown loyalty to British Airways when they decide how to deal with British Airways and the way they behaved over the last couple of months?
I thank my honourable friends. I think I've been very clear about my position. I think that we need to keep working in order to protect as many jobs as possible, and we will continue to work with the Restart and Recovery Group in order to find ways in which to help the aviation sector to recover.
48 and 49 withdrawn, so we come to the final question from Ben Bradshaw.
Given it has no basis in science and will inflict further damage on a travel industry that's already on its knees and is widely opposed in this House, including this lunchtime by the chairman of the 1922 committee. Would it not be better, rather than to introduce this quarantine for 2 or 3 weeks, just to abandon it and just leave it there?
I've been very clear that the priority for this government is to halt or limit the spread of coronavirus, and it has to be accepted that we need to work in order to find those measures that enable airlines and flights and passengers to travel safely, but also to stop that importation of imported cases as our infection rate reduces. We are working hard across government in order to find policy measures in order to achieve that. And that is what the quarantine policy is about.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I am suspending the House for 5 minutes. Thanks, everyone.
Order. Order. Statement from the Home Secretary, Priti Patel.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And with your permission, I would like to make a statement about the introduction of public health measures at the border in response to coronavirus. This is another cross-government measure in our continued collective fight against the virus to save lives and protect the British public by preventing a second wave of this disease. Because our priority has always been to protect people's health and to keep those in the UK safe from the virus, and introducing this measure now will play an important role in our fight against coronavirus. The tragic events of recent months have shown that in a world of serious threats to the UK and to global stability, pandemics have no boundaries. Throughout this national endeavour, the introduction of public health measures has been to protect the public, keep the virus under control, and now to protect our hard-won progress as we move in the right direction. The scientific advice has been consistent and clear, and it is thanks to the collective determination and the resolve of the British public we are past the peak, but we are now more vulnerable to infections being brought in from abroad. Some have suggested that public health measures at the border should have been introduced when the virus was at its peak. However, at that time, the scientific advice was clear that such measures would have made little difference when domestic transmission was widespread. But now, the transmission rate in the United Kingdom continues to decline, and international travel is likely to resume from its record low. Therefore, the scientific advice is that imported cases of the virus pose a more significant threat to our national effort and our recovery. Travellers from overseas could become a high proportion of the overall number of infections in the UK and therefore increase the spread of the disease. The government has therefore taken a proportionate and time-limited approach to protect the health of the British public. Madam Deputy Speaker, I will recap and recall to the House the key points of the public health measures the government is putting in place from the 8th of June. These temporary requirements are set out in the full health protection regulations laid today, and these will apply across England, with devolved administrations laying their own regulations to set out their enforcement approaches. To limit the spread of infection, arrivals must self-isolate for 14 days. This is the incubation period of coronavirus, and this follows expert medical advice and is in line with the NHS Test and Trace Service self-isolation period for anyone who has been in contact with the disease. Working with key industries, the government has deliberately included a limited number of exemptions to the self-isolation rules to allow essential services and supply chains to continue, keeping food on our tables and getting vital medical and PPE to the front line. The responsibility for sector-specific exemptions sits with relevant government departments. Arrivals to the UK will be required to fill in a contact locator form, including details as to where they will isolate and how they can be contacted. This form will be found on gov.uk, and a government-led working group with the industry has developed a process for carriers to inform travellers on the information they need to provide in order to travel to the UK. The form must be completed in advance of travel to provide details of the journey, and Border Force will be at the front line of enforcing this requirement. Passengers will require a receipt, either printed or on their phone electronically, to prove that they have completed the form. And Border Force will undertake spot checks at the border and may refuse entry to non-resident nationals who refuse to comply. They will have the power to impose a £100 fixed penalty notice to those who do not comply. And our fantastic frontline Border Force officers are world-class and consistently working to keep our borders safe and secure. The data collected will be used by Public Health England, who will undertake checks and ensure people understand and are following the rules. And if Public Health England have reason to believe someone is not following the law as they should be, they will inform the police. We trust the British people and our visitors to play their part in acting responsibly and following the rules to control the spread of coronavirus. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will not allow a reckless minority to put our domestic recovery at risk, so there will be penalties and enforcement for those who break them. A breach of self-isolation could result in a £1,000 fixed penalty notice in England or potential prosecution. And this programme will work alongside Test and Trace to help us further minimise the public health threat of coronavirus. Madam Deputy Speaker, Secretaries of State from the Cabinet Office, Transport, Business and Health have worked across government, the devolved administrations, with science and industry to develop the policy carefully for this public health action. In line with all government COVID-19 measures, and as I announced on the 22nd of May, the measures will be kept under regular review to ensure they remain proportionate and necessary. I can inform the House that the first review will take place in the week commencing the 28th of June, and they will be assessed on an ongoing basis thereafter, together with all other measures to fight this disease. We will publish in due course more information on the criteria that must be satisfied to lift these health measures, but I can update the House on some factors that will be considered. And these include the rate of infection and transmission internationally and the credibility of reporting, the measures that international partners have put in place, levels of imported cases in other countries and where they are more relaxed border measures, and the degree to which antibody and other methods of testing prove effective in minimising health risk. Country-specific reports will be provided to allow us to monitor global progress. But we will only consider reviewing these measures when the evidence shows that it is safe to do so, because public health will always come first. And as we have considered for all our cross-government COVID-19 measures, we will take into account the impact on economy and the industry. The aviation and travel industry is home to some of Britain's most successful businesses and supports thousands of jobs. Across government, we understand how tough the public health measures to prevent a second wave of coronavirus are for this sector. The industry has a proud record of making safety of its passengers and staff its #1 priority. It also has a record of dynamism and innovation. Engagement with the industry is crucial, and we are asking them to work with us on these measures. We are liaising with bodies such as the International Civil Aviation Organisation on this and on other COVID-19 related issues, and we will continue to work closely with companies and carriers. And that is why, with my right honourable friend, the Transport Secretary, we will tomorrow host a roundtable to work across the travel sector and the broader business sector as well, on how we can innovate and move together, but also form a long-term plan for the industry. The government and industry share the same aim, to get Britain and our economy moving again in a way in which is safe and also practical for everyone. Madam Deputy Speaker, our priority has always been the safety of our people. This has driven our evidence-led cross-government approach to this whole crisis. The Foreign Office will continue to they currently advise against all but essential travel abroad, or no travel at all to a country where the risk of COVID-19 remains unacceptably high. There has been engagement with embassies representing countries from around the world to explain our approach. And taking this public health action, alongside our measures, including test and trace and continued social distancing, in the long run, we will ensure that we can have greater freedom in the longer term. And of course, Madam Deputy Speaker, that includes international travel corridors, a subject that has already this afternoon been discussed in the House. Currently, there should only be essential travel, but across government and with the sector, we will continue to explore all options for future safe travel. And any international approaches will be bilateral and agreed with other countries concerned. And of course, we will need to ensure that those countries are deemed to be safe. We are not alone in our fight against this disease or in the measures we have taken to stop it. Madam Deputy Speaker, these measures are backed by science and supported by the public and are essential to save lives. We know that they will present difficulties for the tourism industry, but that is why we have an unprecedented package of support, the most comprehensive in the world, for employees and for business. But we will all suffer in the long run if we get this wrong. And that is why it is crucial that we introduce these measures now. Let us not throw away our hard-won progress in tackling this virus. And first and foremost, we owe it to the thousands of people who have died, and we owe it also to the millions of people across the whole of the United Kingdom whose sacrifices over the previous months in following social distancing have together helped us to bring this virus under control. I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Home Secretary Nick Thomas-Simmons.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I thank the Home Secretary for her statement and advance sight of it. We've been calling for sensible screening measures at the border for months, and we will of course study the detail of what's been announced. It is vital the UK has a plan for minimising the risk of infections coming into the country. But the Home Secretary must also realise there are fundamental questions she needs to answer. Why these particular measures and why now? From 1st of January to 23rd of March, when the lockdown was imposed, only 273 people were formally quarantined from 4 flights, 3 from Wuhan, 1 from Tokyo, when over 18 million people entered the country by air. Now, the Home Secretary just said in her statement this was because domestic transmission was widespread. But this is what the government's own chief scientific advisor said, and I quote, "A lot of the cases in the UK didn't come from China and didn't come from the places you might have expected. They actually came from European imports and the high level of travel into the UK around that time. And ministers saw on their television screens what was happening in Italy and what was happening in Spain." On the 30th of April, I wrote to the Home Secretary to ask her to publish in full the scientific advice that her decisions on measures at the border at that time were based on, so we could learn the lessons going forward. She hasn't even replied to my letter, and not making all that information public is a mistake. Unfortunately, like too much of the Home Office handling of this crisis, the management of arrivals to the United Kingdom has lacked urgency and coherence. As long ago as the 10th of May, the Prime Minister gave notice of these quarantining measures. Why has the government wasted precious weeks talking about possible border restrictions rather than taking effective actions? If these measures are necessary from the 8th of June, why have they not been necessary in recent weeks, or from when they were first announced by the Home Secretary herself on the 22nd of May? And can the Home Secretary give me her assurance that these measures from Monday next week have been recommended and approved by SAGE? I do join her in her praise of what those at Border Force have done, but can she give me a further assurance the Border Force on the front line will have the resources and all the protection that they need? Madam Deputy Speaker, the government's confusion over arrivals and quarantine has widespread implications for the UK economy, particularly aviation, hospitality and tourism, and related supply chains. Huge numbers of jobs are at risk, yet the crucial package of support for these industries that we on these benches have argued for has yet to materialise. In her statement, the Home Secretary mentioned a roundtable with the Transport Secretary tomorrow with businesses. But the government should already have done that. They should be presenting these steps today as part of an all-encompassing approach to travel to the aviation sector backed up by the published scientific evidence. And this is necessary, Madam Deputy Speaker, because there has to be reassurance that quarantine has a genuine public health benefit now that, according to the government, it did not have in past months. And that these measures are not just a 3-week fudge to try to spare the government embarrassment for failing to grip this issue at the right time. And given, Madam Deputy Speaker, that there is no vaccine at the moment, that Test, Track and Isolate isn't fully up and running as the government promised that it would be, I ask that the Home Secretary makes a commitment that she'll report back to the House before the end of the initial 3-week window on that first review that she mentioned in her statement, outline her proposed exit strategy from these measures, outline her plans for any travel corridors, and can the Home Secretary pass on the message to the government of how urgent it is that that comprehensive package to support jobs is brought forward as soon as possible?
Home Secretary. Madam Deputy Speaker, well, I thank the right honourable gentleman for his comments, his questions and his remarks. And first of all, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think all members of the House will recognise that through the difficulties that the entire country has experienced through coronavirus and throughout this outbreak in particular, across government, led by the scientific advice, but also led by my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, throughout government we have had a comprehensive response. Throughout the outbreak, we have brought in the right measures at the right time. time based on scientific advice. That is dated back to January, as far back as January, throughout February and going into March as well. And during that contained phase, the government had, at the borders in particular, an enhanced monitoring policy and approach to identify symptomatic travellers from high-risk areas in the early stages, and importantly, at that time, to safely triage them through the system. And this was applied to those returning from Wuhan on the 22nd of January, and that approach was broadened. If the Honourable Gentleman would let me finish, please, and would listen to the facts that I'm providing him with, broadened to the whole, they are facts and they're very specific dates, returning from Wuhan on the 22nd of January, and that approach was broadened in conjunction with the Department of Transport for the whole of China on the 25th of January, and then Japan on the 8th of February, Iran on the 25th of February, Northern Italy on the 4th of March, and then the whole of Italy on the 5th of March. And once when there was significant transmission within the UK, border restrictions would have been very marginal in their impact on the epidemic within the UK. Ministers at the time had articulated that across government in the comprehensive way in which this is a cross-government pandemic and all government departments work together. And at that point, it was recognised that they would have contributed a tiny proportion of the number of new infections in the UK. Now that domestic transmission within the UK is coming under control, it is the right time to prepare for these new measures at the border. But the Right Honourable Gentleman did also ask, I think for the benefit of the House, in terms of the health measures that were brought in the very early stages, they were brought in through the General Aircraft Declaration System, through Aviation, so it is through my right honourable friend, the Transport Secretary's Department, in conjunction with Border Force. And when that process concluded, it had covered 13 UK airports, 15 territories, 24 airlines, and 1,116 flights were monitored with a 98% compliance rate on the General Aircraft Declaration. And the purpose of those declarations are, of course, to provide the details of any illnesses on board and therefore inform public health risk assessments so that the appropriate action could therefore be taken with passengers at that particular time. Now, the Right Honourable Gentleman has also asked and touched on a number of other factors, including PPE for border staff. Border Force have been exceptional throughout this crisis, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I think it is worth paying tribute to them and the way in which they have worked in keeping our borders safe and secure. They do have, and throughout this, following all the public health guidance from PH England, adequate PPE protection, and that remains and will continue. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, in response to the Right Honourable Gentleman, he rightly asked about a comprehensive approach for the sector, for travel, tourism, for aviation, the world-class industries that we have in the United Kingdom, and rightly so. I've worked with many of those sectors in my previous career as well. A comprehensive approach is being taken. He asked as to why we're only meeting with them now. That is not the case at all. The Department of Transport, I myself have also been in touch with many representatives from the industry as well. We work across governments, and I know the Honourable Gentleman is nodding his head on that point as well. In response to the Transport Secretary, he would rightly expect a comprehensive approach. That comprehensive approach will be coming forward again on the floor of this House, not just by myself, but my other colleagues, my right honourable friends as well across government who lead those departments, and the collective response to this particular issue.
Madam Gullis.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Quarantine will have an impact upon businesses who rely heavily on the hospitality sector, like ceramics in Stoke-on-Trent. Churchill China and Steel Light have spoken to me on that point. So can my right honourable friend explain and reassure ceramic manufacturers that quarantine will not hinder them as they try to reboot the local economy?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right in terms of the fantastic ceramics industry in Stoke-on-Trent, and he, of course, is a great advocate for them as well. There are some very important points just to make on this, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I reiterate again, these are public health measures designed to protect the British public for imported cases of coronavirus. But, of course, we are global Britain. Our borders are not shut. Let me just emphasise that point to the House. We are a global Britain when it comes to goods in particular and exports, either coming in, goods going out of the country as well. All of that will continue, and businesses, of course, continue to be at the forefront of being Global Britain, and that, of course, will continue for the ceramics industry.
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and may I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement, and like her, pay tribute to our border force and other key workers. Madam Deputy Speaker, the Scottish National Party have been calling on the UK Government to introduce public health measures at UK borders for some months now. The Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine at the University of Oxford have said that the effectiveness of quarantine during a viral outbreak relies on the timing and accuracy of the quarantine period, as well as the ability of individuals and healthcare providers to follow quarantine procedures. And I fear that the Home Secretary's statement does not fully address these matters. There has been widespread concern that the UK has been out of step with most other countries who introduced public health measures at their borders far earlier in the pandemic. The best way for her to address the failure to introduce any measures to date, and also the effectiveness of the measures she now proposes, is to publish the evidence and the advice upon which she has relied. Now, the matter was discussed at the SAGE meeting on 7th May, but their advice has yet to be published. Will she undertake to publish that advice from the meeting of 7th May today? And can she tell us what advice have SAGE given about the widely reported aspects in which it is suggested the government intends to water down the quarantine proposals? Do SAGE think these quarantine measures will be effective if these watering down proposals are in place? Now, I note that she said that the measures will be considered regularly, commencing in the week beginning 28th of June. But can she tell us how long overall she envisages the measures will be in place? And finally, these measures at the border are her responsibility as Home Secretary, but part of their delivery and part of their enforcement will be in Scotland and will be the responsibility of the Scottish Government. So will she undertake to meaningfully engage with my colleagues in the Scottish Government on their requirements before any potential changes are made in the weeks and months ahead to these?
Home Secretary.
Well, I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her questions and her comments. There are a number of points, if I may just allude to. I completely reiterate and restate the points that I made about the measures that have been taken from the beginning of the year in terms of public health measures within the aviation sector, but also enhanced monitoring at the borders to identify symptomatic travellers from high-risk areas. That happened early and safely, and people were triaged to the health systems. I think that's really important for everybody to remember that as well, and be mindful of this, because these are public health measures. She again, and in fact, if I may say so, in answer to the Right Honourable Gentleman as well, made the point about publishing the advice through SAGE. SAGE, of course, published their advice accordingly, and that is ongoing. But very specifically, she referred to potential downgrading of these measures. These are public health measures, and this is not something for the Home Office or myself as Home Secretary to consider in isolation or independently. This is a part of a wide package in terms of public health measures, in line with the public health regulations that have been laid in Parliament and put down in terms of reducing the R value and protecting the British public. And I think it is really important, Madam Deputy Speaker, for the British public and for all members, Right Honourable and Honourable members of this House, to put this into perspective in the context that we are in a national health emergency right now. This isn't about the convenience or inconvenience of certain regulations and measures being put down and the application of them. We are here to make sure that we protect public health first and foremost. And that is why it is important whenever these measures are reconsidered in due course, and they will be aligned with other regulations when they are reviewed as well, that we look at this within the totality as to how we can protect the public and their health.
Now, I would like to get everybody in. That will require short questions and short answers. Steve Bryan.
Thank you. If I'm honest, I think many people will think this is the right move at the wrong time. We keep being told to use our common sense. The idea that this was wrong when Europe was at the centre of a pandemic, and right now, it doesn't add up to me, but maybe that's just me. But we are where we are, and we can't go back, so we start from here. Now, hundreds of my constituents rely on Southampton Airport for their livelihoods. It was on its knees before COVID. So while I appreciate there's much talk today of travel corridors, can I ask my right honourable friend whether the government considered travel gates to block incoming travellers from certain countries based on the science. Basically, a more targeted risk-based approach to the screening of passengers, as happens with aviation security standards now.
So my honourable friend is absolutely right. There'll be a range of measures, and I think I should just emphasise to the House and all honourable and right honourable members. Of course, this is part of our ongoing dialogue with the industry. This isn't just for government to specify the type of actions that the sector should undertake. We have to innovate together and also look at new international aviation health screening options, opportunities, but the way in which we can work to innovate and set new standards internationally. We want to be at the forefront of that, and that is something that we want to urge our industry to do as well.
Yvette Cooper.
Sir Patrick Vallance has said that the crisis escalated in this country as a result of many, many cases coming from Spain and Italy during March. So clearly the triage system wasn't working. The Select Committee has also been told that in a 10-day period from the 13th of March to the 23rd of March, up to 10,000 passengers with coronavirus are likely to have arrived at our ports and airports. The Home Secretary has still not published the science that we were promised behind these decisions. Can I urge her now to do so and to tell us what is her estimate of the number of people in the next 3-week period who are likely to arrive in the UK with coronavirus?
Home Secretary.
Well, I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her comments. I've already been clear about the measures that were brought in. The enhanced monitoring measures at the borders, I have been clear and I've outlined them. I've even provided dates to the House and I've given examples in terms of the number of airports, the number of territories, the number of airlines and the flights that were monitored throughout that period of the 22nd of January to the 12th of March. In terms of publishing the advice that I think the Honourable Lady is referring specifically to from the Home Office, I will absolutely ensure that the Select Committee receives that. And in terms of the number of incoming passengers, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is well known and documented through air passenger data, and that does not include ports, ports are separate, that the number of passengers travelling and arriving to the United Kingdom has been at an all-time low and have completely fallen off. That is something obviously we can't predict for the next 3 weeks, but obviously working with the Department of Transport in particular, we will collect that information and we will make that public.
Dr. Ben Spencer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The introduction of a 14-day quarantine is a very blunt tool, with many downsides and consequences, and it effectively grounds the aviation industry. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that rather than using this blunt tool, we should move as quickly as possible to a precise and targeted approach based on science and international safety standards that will protect passengers, the public, but also staff working in the airlines, the airports and on public transport, and in doing so enable our planes to fly again, saving livelihoods and businesses while keeping the public safe?
Well, my honourable friend makes very, very important points, and actually I would like to pay tribute to the aviation sector and the industry. They are dynamic, they are innovative, and when we look at the work that they have done over decades when it comes to keeping the public safe, when it comes to aviation travel, they have been world leading. That is exactly what we want to do in terms of the work that we undertake with them. Of course, this is an international crisis. No one person, no one organisation has a bespoke way of working throughout this crisis for the aviation sector. My final point, Madam Deputy Speaker, on this, is, of course, planes are still flying and goods are coming into the United Kingdom. I've made the point about exports goods. This is still very important for the aviation sector, for the freight sector in particular. And of course, that's very important to the health of our economy, but also the way in which we can continue to innovate. And
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Home Secretary has made much of the scientific advice that earlier in the pandemic it was clear that such measures would have made little difference. Would the Secretary of State acknowledge that as we have an acknowledged death toll approaching 50,000 people, that perhaps that little difference might have been significant to a lot of people in this country at that time? Does she now regret not making that little difference? And could she please answer my right honourable friend's question when he asked if that advice and the advice she refers to today both came from SAGE?
The Honourable Lady will be very well aware that not just working with SAGE, but representatives of SAGE in government departments across government, that is the scientific advice that we as Minister are guided by. And that is important to consider this in terms of the entire period from January to March and the enhanced measures that were taken at the border. And I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is important to recall and be very mindful of the enhanced public health protection measures that were undertaken. And had those measures not been put in place, the severity of what could have followed could have been even more damaging than we've seen over recent months.
Faye Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the introduction of a self-isolation period for those arriving in the UK. Like this government, I want to do all I can to protect rural Mid Wales from a second spike in the virus. But what discussions has my right honourable friend had with the Welsh Government and with rural police forces to ensure that this can be enforced in a four nations approach?
Good question.
My friend is absolutely right, and I pay tribute to the devolved administrations. And I know one of the questions, in fact, the Right Honourable Gentleman asked me about the time period as to when this was announced and now these measures coming into place. Much of this has been complicated because of the different approach in terms of powers that are devolved around enforcement in particular. So devolved administrations will, of course, be laying their own regulations around enforcement, but we have had constant contact and discussion across the four nations with the devolved administrations from the get-go, from the outset, and of course that will continue.
Daniel Zeigner.
This isn't just about tourism and business, important though they are, it's also about people. And my constituent, Professor Matthew Gaunt's 8-year-old son Dylan lives in Germany, and he and his ex-wife have joint custody. And in former times, Professor Gaunt used to visit fortnightly to stay with Dylan for 4 days. Now, the pandemic has torn families apart across the nation, but it's an international problem too. Yeah. So can the Home Secretary ensure that such difficult cases are prioritised?
Home Secretary. I say to my honourable friend, this is such a difficult time for everybody across the world. And of course, we've all been split apart from family, friends and loved ones. And of course, we do want to ensure that we can prioritise key cases and look at, as we move forward with changes to regulations as well, and as we keep this under review, how we can do our utmost to unite friends, family and loved ones again.
Teresa Villas.
Can I welcome the huge amount of work I know she's doing on air bridges? And can I urge her suspend the implementation of this blanket quarantine requirement to give just a few more weeks to get those safe air corridors in place so we can save jobs in aviation and let families go on their summer breaks in the sun?
I thank my right honourable friend for her question. And there are some important points here in terms of how collectively we can work with the travel sector, not just aviation, but across every single carrier, whether it's coaches, trains, ferries as well. They're all part of the health and well-being of the travel sector and the travel economy. And of course, we will work with everybody on this. The fact of the matter is these are complicated. You've heard me say in my statement, we would require bilateral agreements with countries as well, which is exactly what the FCO are working on. And this is why this is a cross-government effort to ensure that we can get our country moving again, but also do the right thing in terms of keeping the public safe.
Lloyd Russell-Moyle.
At the start of this crisis, I had border people writing to me saying they had no PPE. I had constituents writing to me saying that they'd come back from northern Italy and Spain without being stopped at all at the border. It was a completely bungled response at the beginning. And now the horse has bolted, and of course our recovery is one of the worst in Europe, and our death rates are the second worst in the world. The government's now embarrassed and trying to close that stable. But I'm afraid it's too late. So to build any sort of trust, will the Secretary of State publish the advice that she has on this matter before she destroys our hospitality sector?
Secretary.
I'd say to the honourable gentleman that it is not my intention to destroy any sectors of our country or our economy, and I think that is a gross distortion of the comments and remarks that I've made. And my second point is I refer the honourable gentleman to the comments that I've already made around the scientific advice.
Dr. Liam Fox.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm afraid I simply cannot get my head around the public health mental gymnastics of this policy.
If such a barrier was required, why was it not introduced earlier in the outbreak? And if it is a contingency measure against a so-called second wave, why apply it to countries with a lower infection rate than we already have? And surely the answer lies in the government's test and tracing system rather than unnecessary economic isolation. And I know my right honourable friend's not answerable for the public health elements, so she can tell us, please, from a Home Office perspective, in the event of air bridges being established, how will it be possible to identify transit and, more importantly, stopover passengers who may be able to come through the bridge from higher risk areas to the UK?
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for the point that is made around transit passengers, but also future travel corridors. I'm sure we'll all agree on a term to use in the future. The fact of the matter is, from a Home Office perspective, we have created the contact locator form, and it is that data which will be instrumental in basically giving people that safe passage, the clearance to go through and transit onto other locations. But the fact of the matter is, Madam Deputy Speaker, that piece of work has been done. We should be able to, and this again looks to the future, working with the aviation sector, we should look to how we can adapt that so that in due course that locator form can contain so much more other information, including COVID test data or even electronic travel authorisation, that can help to really bolster the industry in the sector. As I've said, get people moving, get planes flying, get people travelling again internationally, but also give public confidence about the health protection that they're looking for.
Let's several Roberts.
At a time when most European countries are in a much improved condition than that of the UK, the concern of communities in constituencies like mine is transition by travellers within and between the nations of the UK. Now, I've spoken to the police, to representatives of the tourism industry in North Wales and local community leaders. We all want our attractions and accommodation to open as soon as possible. We therefore need to be able to provide every assurance to vulnerable residents and their families who are anxious about the risks implicit in thousands, and I emphasise, thousands of people arriving in their communities on the day after internal holiday travel restrictions are lifted in the UK. Will she come back to the House to explain what steps she's taken to ensure that holidays at home are safe for everyone?
Order. If we're to get everybody in, we do need to have very short questions and short answers. Just the question, please, will be the best way of us getting through this. Home Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. First of all, let me pay tribute to the police across the country for the way in which they have been following the approach when it comes to enforcement, but also encouraging people on social distancing. And I'm very well aware, not just across the four nations, but in particular in Wales, of great work that has taken place. I'd be more than happy, working with my colleagues across government, to come back when it comes to the domestic tourism, when it comes to vulnerability and people that are shielded, to give the assurances around public health measures and the protections that are required.
Peter Gibson.
More than 90% of countries have deployed a form of quarantine so far. Does my right honourable friend believe that the measures she has outlined today are being taken by the rest of the world are consistent, and are they vital to keeping our citizens safe?
Well, I thank my friend for the point and his question. I think actually there is a reflection here in terms of the fact that other countries, of course, have introduced measures at the border, whether it's self-isolation, and much of this is self-isolation as well, on the basis of protecting their domestic population from imported spreading of the virus. It is right that we're doing this now. The science has been consistent on this, and that is absolutely in the right interest when it comes to protecting public health.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Northern Ireland is the only part of the United Kingdom with a land border, and therefore on the front line, literally. Can the Minister outline discussions and talks with the Northern Ireland Assembly that she referred to, how she believes that she can marry the health measures at our ports and airports, along with those in neighbouring Republic of Ireland, to ensure the viability of our ports and our airports for trade and tourism, but also for ensuring safety and wisdom?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question, and he's absolutely right. Of course, when it comes to trade, keeping passenger flows going, we have been working with my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, who will be very aware of some of the discussions that have been taking place. But of course, as ever, we undertake these measures for the right reasons, to collectively stop the spread of the virus and to protect public health. And I'll be very happy to talk to him over future days as well, in the run-up to the 8th of June, in terms of the work that we're actually taking in Northern Ireland.
Sir Graham Braid.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Hundreds of thousands of jobs will be lost if the airlines are unable to fly their crucial peak summer schedules. But the airlines are making those decisions now. Will my right honourable friend undertake to make sure that we have clear criteria for air corridors and the first list of safe countries well before the 3-week review on the 29th of June?
Well, if I can assure my right honourable friend, and I'm very familiar with his own regional airport as well, and the operators of that airport, that is something that my right honourable friend, the Transport Secretary, will be leading on. And of course, I will work with him and all colleagues across government as well to ensure that we start really pursuing those plans and proposals. So of course we can get aviation up and running again, safeguard jobs, safeguard the economy, but also, as I said at the same time, look at the methods in which we can protect public health.
Chris Bryant.
The horse has bolted. Yeah. I don't understand why she doesn't get this. She won't be able to screen people at the ports. She can't track them when they leave the airports. She can't enforce the quarantine when people get to their homes. And she can't even ensure that these people who might be COVID positive aren't using public transport to get from the ports to their homes. So she's not going to be protecting anybody. Can she name a single country in Europe which has a higher infection rate than the UK?
Home Secretary.
Well, I refer the honourable gentleman to my statement and the reason as to why these measures are coming in right now. I recognise from the tone of his question that he fundamentally disagrees with the government's position and the approach that the government has taken collectively. But the fact of the matter is, when it comes to other countries, we will work bilaterally in terms of travel corridors and how we can move the sector forward to bring in the right kind of public health measures that safeguard countries, travellers and passengers. That is the right thing to do. And as I've already explained to the House, Madam Deputy Speaker, the science has been consistent on this, and these measures are here to protect public health.
Henry Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. What advice did the Home Secretary receive from the Scientific Advisory Group on emergencies with regard to introducing these quarantine measures? And will she look to have a more regular review of them, weekly, I would suggest, rather than 3-weekly?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I explained earlier on in my statement in terms of the advice that has been provided consistently, both to the Home Office and to other government departments, in terms of the review, I've outlined already the 3-week review period, but that review will be aligned with the other health reviews that are taking place, based on protecting the public. And of course, these are public health measures, and it's right that we look at all public health measures and regulations in the round to protect the British public.
Kangan Mahindra.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Before I ask my question, can I put on record that my wife does actually work as a contractor for an international travel company? Can my right honourable friend confirm that these health measures will be time limited and remain proportional to the threat facing our country, and will be altered when we can be sure it won't jeopardise the health of UK citizens?
Home Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. I have said today already that these measures will be reviewed, and they, of course, will also be reviewed and aligned with the other health measures that have been brought in. And I emphasise again, Madam Deputy Speaker, that it's important to look at this within the totality, in the round, alongside the actual desire of our country and government to get the R value down so that we can unlock and reopen society in so many other ways.
John Speller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And just now we had a junior Transport Minister, subbing for the Chancellor, wringing her hands about the aviation industry. And the Home Secretary has just thrown her, the industry and its workers under the bus. And at the same time has put up a massive "Britain is closed" sign. So at the very least, will she demand from the Chancellor of the Exchequer that he extends the furlough scheme to try and avert hundreds of thousands of workers being thrown on the dole in the next few weeks?
Well, first of all, Madam Deputy Speaker, I do find the right honourable gentleman's tone somewhat objectionable. I've been incredibly supportive of the aviation industry, and I can hear sarcastic cries of tough. I think it's important to reflect the way in which the aviation industry is dynamic, it's innovative, it's huge to our economy, and I'm not shutting it down. On the contrary, I'm working with my right honourable friend, the Transport Secretary, the Business Secretary, and all colleagues across government. These are cross-government measures which I will restate to all members of this House when it comes to protecting the public health of our nation. And of course, I hear his comment with regards to furlough scheme, protecting jobs. Of course, we all want to protect jobs. This has been a tremendously difficult period. Economically, we will have major economic issues to confront as we come out of this dreadful, dreadful situation. We're not on our own. The international economy is in exactly the same space, and it is right that we work collectively rather than in an aggressive way and in a hostile way to find the right solutions for the people of this country in terms of health protection, but also their long-term jobs and their livelihoods.
Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. After 9/11, the aviation industry found a way almost instantly to find box cutters and get them off aeroplanes. After the shoe bomber, the aviation industry found a way almost right away to detect the smallest quantity of liquid in people's luggage. So if tomorrow the aviation industry and the inventive people around the world are able to find a way to swab and take temperatures and get an almost instant result back before and after every flight, will she drop these regulations?
Well, first of all, Madam Deputy Speaker, it is not for me personally to drop these regulations. These regulations are being laid across in the House in conjunction with other government departments. But it is, and I do want to emphasise this, and I've said this on the 22nd of May, that this is just one component. We're speaking about track, trace and isolate, potential fast testing for passengers. There are many other aspects to how we can make aviation and travel safe going forward to protect passengers and their health. That is exactly what we need to do, working with the aviation sector and the travel sector and other carriers. And of course, it's for them to innovate, and we will support them and work with them to make sure that we can look at all measures that we can bring forward for the sector to keep passengers safe, but at the same time to protect the British public.
23 and 24 withdrawn, so we go to Lillian Greenwood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Scientific research into this virus is thankfully an international effort. So can she explain the evidence that she's seen that underpins her decision to introduce a blanket 14-day quarantine now, at precisely the time that other countries are beginning to ease restrictions that they introduced months ago? Why is the UK government's approach so at odds with our neighbours?
Well, first of all, I refer the Honourable Lady to my statement in terms of why these measures are coming in right now. And my second point is these are cross-government measures. These have not been taken in isolation, i.e. just one department. We are working across government, led by the Department of Health, working with my right honourable friend, the Transport Secretary, working with the Business Secretary, working with the Chancellor of the Exchequer across government. These measures have been put in place collectively, and they will stay in place until the public health situation in this country changes. And this government, Madam Deputy Speaker, finally, is absolutely committed to protecting the public health of our nation. That is the right priority. I know she clearly disagrees with that and shakes her head, but at the same time, we will continue to work with the industry to look at new measures going forward.
Sally-Ann Hart.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Looking at our soft borders, which are our beaches, can my right honourable friend reassure the residents of Hastings and Rye that for the migrants illegally crossing the channel in small boats who are not returned to France are being given health checks for their own safety and well-being and for the safety and well-being of my constituents?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely aware of the work that we are doing on this right now, including returns to France directly, so she can have that assurance. And when it comes to the self-isolation measures, they equally apply to people that come to our country illegally.
27 withdrawn, so we go to James Sunderland.
Madam Deputy Speaker, many of my constituents depend upon the aviation sector for their livelihoods. Bracknell also has the offices of over 150 global companies. Could the Home Secretary please assure me that the support for my constituency and beyond will be given through a pragmatic application of the policy, and also that the policy will not just be reviewed but lifted at the first opportunity?
Home Secretary.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question. He's absolutely right and makes a very powerful case on behalf of his constituents and their livelihoods for the sector that they are employed in. And it is absolutely right, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we as a government continue to work to give that support. I'm committed to doing that, as are all Secretary of State across government.
29 withdrawn, so we go to Natalie Elphick.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
When reviewing safe journeys in the coming weeks, will my right honourable friend consider that ferries have a COVID-secure option that aeroplanes simply don't have? And can I ask her to keep front of mind our beautiful White Cliffs country and the Dover-Calais ferry for not just a safe and enjoyable holiday break, but also to save our local jobs and livelihoods?
True. Well, my other friend's absolutely right when it comes to representing her constituency, her constituents, but also the local economy too. And that applies across the country where we have ports. She's absolutely right also to highlight the need to have safe travel, but travel obviously that can be applied consistently across travel carriers as well. And that is something obviously that my honourable friend, the Transport Secretary, and I will be putting forward and raising, discussing tomorrow in our roundtable.
David Linden.
Many thanks, Madam Deputy Speaker. What discussions has she had with the Chancellor of the Exchequer about how to mitigate the impact of these measures on the aviation industry, and how will they affect efforts to support it to play a sustainable role in rebuilding the economy at local, national and regional level?
Yes, Madam Deputy Speaker, discussions have taken place through the usual channels across government, and in fact there have been, up until recently, a series of committees involving the Treasury and every single government department that is involved in this public measure and in this public health measures to discuss the impacts, economic but also health impacts, and the way in which these measures would be brought together and enforced and applied across the 4 nations.
Tom Hunt.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A couple of months ago, my constituents were overwhelmingly of the view that there should have been an international quarantine introduced then. Overwhelmingly. I believe right now there's still finely balanced, but just of a view, but one is necessary. So I will be supporting the government on this. But at the same time, I am getting more and more emails from constituents who have loved ones in other countries. So please commit to a flexible approach, and at the nearest opportunity, please do relax it.
Well, I think, Madam Deputy Speaker, not only, I hear everybody's comments, and I am very conscious of this, as is my right honourable friend, the Transport Secretary, as is the whole of government. The fact of the matter is we all want to be reunited with friends and loved ones as soon as possible. We have to do this in a safe and in a responsible way, and that is what this government is committed to achieving.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Reports suggest that SAGE was not asked for updated advice before this announcement was made. So I asked the Secretary of State, what is the estimate of the likely numbers in the outlined exemption categories to her policy, and what is the scientific assessment of potential transmission from these groups?
Well, I referred the lady to my statement earlier. We have based this on scientific advice across government, and that is scientific advice not just within the Home Office but across other government departments as well. So, as I've said in my statement, that information in due course will be provided in the normal way, but it is important to reflect and recognise as to why these measures are coming in place. That is to protect the health and well-being of the British public.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton Brown.
On behalf of a significant number of constituents whose jobs are affected in the travel, tourism and leisure business, could I ask my right honourable friend if she would seriously consider and review as urgently as possible establishing air bridges, particularly with countries where the rate of infection is lower than our own?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I think I've answered this question previously, but absolutely right. It is our determination to ensure that we work with the travel industry, with all carriers, to find the safe way in which people can travel, and of course that is our priority.
Emily Lilbert.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. By mid-March, over 80 countries had imposed quarantine measures and travel restrictions. By May, it was reported that over 95,000 people had flown into the UK through lockdown. Does she feel her delayed action has contributed more or less to the UK having the second highest coronavirus death rate in the world?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I could not have been clearer in my statement, and also when I outlined the enhanced monitoring process that took place at the border between the 22nd of January and the 12th of March. And it is right that those measures were undertaken, and I've said in my statement as to why these measures are being brought in now.
Andrew Griffith.
Speaker, and I welcome my right honourable friend's commitment to show that Britain is open for business. We have a designated testing minister. Can I tell my constituents who are devastated in Arundel and South Downs who will be the accountable minister for putting in place agreements with safe countries?
Home Secretary.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to ask this question because these are cross-government measures. So in terms of bilateral agreements, of course, that will be with the Foreign Office. On the test and trace and isolate approach, that is the Health Department. And when it comes to sector-specific issues, they will be department by department. But when it comes to travel and aviation, this will be obviously the Secretary of State for Transport and myself, and I'll continue to work collaboratively across with all government departments.
Henry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Regardless of the merits of otherwise of this measure, it will disproportionately hit tourist economies, especially in rural areas such as the one I represent. The Secretary of State said earlier that she understood the impact. Can I ask what specific conversations she's had with the Chancellor about extending furlough and issuing grants to help the sector survive?
Well, I have discussions with the Chancellor on a regular basis, and of course that applies to all aspects of the economy, not just the furlough scheme. And I'd be very happy, having heard the honourable gentleman, to take away specific points that he has, and I will raise them with the Chancellor.
Sir Desmond Swain.
To limit a second wave of economic damage, will she bring forward the review of this policy by 10 days?
Home Secretary.
I have said, Madam Deputy Speaker, the review of this policy has been outlined in the statement, and that is the approach that we are taking.
Manira Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Home Secretary has acknowledged in her statement that introducing public health measures at our borders once we were at peak was too late. So will she finally concede that we should have introduced this well before community transmission was widespread? And will she answer many honourable members' questions with a direct yes or no? Was SAGE consulted on and did it recommend the measures that she is announcing today?
Home Secretary.
I have outlined my position in the statement earlier on, and I think it's important to say, when it comes to measures at the borders, I've outlined the dates in which enhanced measures were taken, but also I have not referred to the millions of British nationals who were stranded abroad, and had we have closed our borders in the way in which the Honourable Lady is referring to, they would not have been able to come back to the UK.
Yes, they would. Yes, they would. You don't understand. You don't understand the process.
Barracking, not a good look. We need to get through this quickly. Deanna Davidson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Everyone in this House and my right honourable friend will know the very stark dangers that a second wave could present to our economy, but also to our society. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that by introducing these new health measures at the border, we will be limiting the possibility of a second wave and keeping our citizens safe?
Home Secretary.
Madam Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and she has just emphasised the need to protect the British public from a second wave. And that is the purpose of all the measures, the public health measures the government has been bringing forward. Because at the end of the day, we do not want to lose the gains that we have made in recent weeks. We are past the peak of this virus, and that is something that we still need to continue to double down on and make great progress on.
Ms Elmore.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I have constituents who are due to be travelling in the next 2 to 3 weeks who have been emailing me asking specifically about using public transport or whether family can collect them, all of them, from Heathrow Airport. The Home Secretary doesn't seem to have answered the question despite being asked what will the guidance be, because my constituents need to know now, not in several days or weeks' time.
Madam Speaker, all guidance will be published in advance of June the 8th, and of course that comes from, the guidance will come from other government departments specific to airports, transport, and obviously public health measures as well, so the guidance will be made available.
Pausing.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Many businesses, especially those engaged in manufacturing, have a need to get a key worker on site quickly, and that could be a UK employee returning from holiday not able to work from home, or an overseas specialist such as a plant maintenance engineer to keep a plant going. Will there be an exemption to support British business in circumstances such as these?
So, my friend's absolutely right to ask the question. We will be publishing the list of exemptions, and within that there will be critical infrastructure workers and specific categories led by the key departments that are sponsoring those exemptions, and of course there will be key sectors that are also included in that exemption list.
Afsal Khan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The government's quarantine policy is not universal, and there is a relatively long list of occupations exempted from the self-isolation requirement. Can the Home Secretary confirm that those exempted from quarantine will still be tested for coronavirus upon arrival at the UK border? And if they test positive for the virus, what will they be required to do?
Secretary.
Well, I think in answer to the honourable gentleman's question, many of those are deemed as key workers. They have access to testing. They are being encouraged to test. And of course, as anyone that is symptomatic or test positive, they must follow the guidance that has been put in place, which is to either, if they're sick, to obviously self-isolate, and if they're symptomatic, they must self-isolate, but also get advice, medical advice, and get treatment.
Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. With small businesses particularly being asked to step up and reboot our economy, they need certainty. And I've been contacted by a business in my constituency concerned that, notwithstanding the general advice for non-essential travel, some employees are still determined to have their holidays. Can you give my right honourable friend give clarity over the status of returning holidaymakers in terms of whether the business should swallow that cost or whether they should be forced to take it out of annual leave?
Well, if I may, Madam Deputy Speaker, I cannot give specific advice for businesses and employees, but what I would say is that it's important to follow the Foreign Office travel advice and guidance right now. And the FCO has been very clear about not travelling, obviously because of coronavirus, but that all non-essential travel should not take place.
Christine Matheson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, this will affect the aviation sector and also hospitality and travel and tourism, but upstream it will also affect our aerospace manufacturing sector. Can the Home Secretary tell the House what specific economic impact assessment was made on the effect of the aerospace sector with this policy?
My friend is right to raise the economics of this. This has been discussed in various economic committees at government, and of course I have been speaking to the Chancellor, working across government with my colleagues, and it's important to reflect we've had those discussions, and impact assessments have been undertaken through government departments in the right kind of way.
Robert Goodwill.
Thank you. 300 people are working safely today constructing the £4 billion Anglo-American Sirius mine in North Yorkshire. The driving of the 1 mile deep shaft and the 23 mile long tunnel to T-spot does require a small number of specialist engineers from places like Germany and Austria living in specialist accommodation away from their families. Could you give me an assurance that workers like this will be part of the exemption from the quarantine?
Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I understand the case that the honourable gentleman is making, and of course we do have an extensive exemption list for specialist skills and individuals that are required for key projects and key work. But I will absolutely take the full details away from him and raise that with the Department of Business.
Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you. The exclusion of medical and care professionals from the travel restrictions highlights how essential they are to the UK. It also highlights how problematic the government's new immigration rules will be. Will she commit to a much fairer and safer immigration policy than that are currently on the table?
Home Secretary.
I'm sorry, Madam Speaker, I missed the honourable lady's last sentence. I didn't quite hear her, but I'll happily follow up. I think that was in relation to the immigration system, the points-based system, but I will happily follow up with her again.
Paul Maynard.
The Right Honourable Lady just made reference to the exempt professions that are going to be covered by this measure. Given the credibility of it is hanging by a very thin thread right now, can she reassure me that members of Parliament will not be on that list of exempt professions?
Home Secretary.
This is an issue that has been discussed extensively, so I think when the honourable gentleman sees the exemption list, he'll be very clear as to who qualifies and who doesn't.
Stephen Doughty.
Madam Deputy Speaker, like care homes, I fear that the failure to act when it could have made a difference will be one of the great tragedies of this crisis when the inevitable inquiries follow. And the Home Secretary keeps saying that she was following the science and the science was consistent. But the Chief Scientific Advisor to the Government said to the Health Committee on the 5th of May that the UK got many, many different imports of the virus that seeded right the way across the country as early as March. Now, if that's the case, why did the government let in 23.7 million passengers, many of them British, returning from abroad from hotspots between the 1st of January and the 31st of March? Why did they not put measures in place earlier? And will she now not only publish the advice, but tell us, is it true that Sage first discussed this on the 3rd of February? Was she involved in that discussion? Was the Transport Secretary? And who overruled who about taking action?
Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Sage papers are being published and they are in the public domain, so he can look out for those and see what information has been put in place. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I do come back to the point that I made earlier on about the enhanced monitoring process that were taken at the border, all of which I highlighted in my opening remarks.
Christian Wakeford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Would my right honourable friend advise whether or not she believes we got the science right earlier on, And if so, are we getting the science right now in terms of quarantine and putting restrictions in place in terms of travellers?
Home Secretary.
What I'd say to my honourable friend is that the government has been guided by the science from the outset of this, and this isn't just for one department, this is across government, and collectively we have been guided by that scientific advice, and that has been consistent when it comes to public health measures at the border, which is why these measures are being introduced now.
Thank you. Oh, point of order, Karen Bradley.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. On a point of order, can I welcome the Prime Minister's announcement earlier that he intends to extend the proxy voting scheme to those that are shielded and unable to attend the chamber and vote in person. But I must say that I do have some concerns about the way the announcement has taken place and how it will be implemented. So can I ask you, Madam Deputy Speaker, if you can obtain this information from Mr Speaker? First of all, what advance notice did he have of the Prime Minister's intention to make this announcement today? Could he confirm that the present pilot scheme for proxy voting, and let's be clear, the proxy voting scheme that we are currently using for maternity and paternity leave is a pilot scheme. Can he confirm that that will expire in July 2020 and that it has a number of structural issues which the committee which I chair is currently examining, and that as it stands at the moment it is not suitable to be extended to several dozen members on the present basis? Could you ask Mr Speaker if he will agree to convene a meeting between the Leader of the House, myself and the Clerk of the House so we can discuss these matters urgently? Can Mr Speaker give the House an assurance that he will not allow any scheme to be implemented which obliges members to disclose, on all sides of this House, to disclose personal information about their health? And could you also ask Mr Speaker if he would confirm that the Government has not to date provided any response to the 3 detailed reports on these issues produced by my committee, one of which was to satisfy the impossibly tight timescale demanded by the Government for the introduction of remote voting, which they then ended up using for a mere 8 days?
Well, I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her point of order. There are a lot of questions in there. I will do my best to respond. Obviously, I can't answer for what discussions the Speaker has or hasn't had with members of the government. I should also say that the Chair is also not responsible for government responses to the reports produced by her committee, although obviously I do hope that those responses will be forthcoming, and I'm sure the Treasury bench will have heard that. She's right to say, I can confirm that the present scheme for proxy voting does expire in July 2020. And I also would confirm that as I'm sure she will appreciate, that the whole House will be interested in hearing the Procedure Committee's expert views on the scheme. And I know her committee has made a great deal of contributions to the debate so far, which have been extremely helpful. I'm sure she knows that the Speaker has taken a very close interest in ensuring that voting in this House is carried out effectively, but key to his response has been that it has due regard to the safety of honourable members and of staff. And I can assure her that he will continue to do so. As for a meeting between herself, the Leader and the Speaker, I'm sure he will respond positively to requests that she makes, as I know he has fairly regular meetings with her anyway.
Point of order.
Point of order, Chris Bryant.
It's sort of tangential but allied, as it were, to the former one. You will know, Madam Deputy Speaker, that yesterday the Leader of the House committed to the Honourable Member, the Chair of the Right Honourable Member, the Chair of the Procedure Committee, that he would be introducing a motion today to deal with allowing some members to participate in questions, urgent statements and urgent questions remotely. That was tabled late last night, since when 3 amendments have been tabled. As I understand it, Mr Speaker is minded to select 3 of those amendments. There are 4 that have been tabled, but 3 have been selected. which means in practice that in particular if we were to suggest that we were going to push those to a vote, that this would be opposed business, and therefore if we get to 7 o'clock, if I get this right, Madam Deputy Speaker, you'll tell me if I've got it wrong, if we get to 7 o'clock and haven't started the debate, that because this is opposed business it cannot then be taken. I also note, further to what the Right Honourable Member just said, that since the Prime Minister has now made a further commitment today, it might be more sensible if we were to have a new motion tomorrow, which covered all of these matters in the round, which we could debate properly, rather than sort of shoved through at the end of the day by surreptitious means without the government allowing any time for it.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his point of order. He has painted a scene of something that might happen at the end of the day, which obviously I can't predict at this point because we don't know whether the business will run till 7. However, not for the first time, he is correct in saying that the motion cannot proceed after 7 p.m. if it is objected to. And in the current circumstances, an amendment standing on the order paper which has been provisionally selected, not withdrawn, and if that amendment is likely to be contested, that would constitute an objection. So it is right that it cannot continue to be heard after 7 p.m.
If I might have another go, very briefly. Just to say, I will be contesting it, just in case there's any doubt at 7 o'clock.
Well, I'm very grateful for the honourable gentleman for clarifying that point. I thought that might be the case, but best to have it on the record.
Speaker. The Leader of the House yesterday announced that witnesses to tomorrow's Domestic Abuse Committee would be able to present evidence remotely if they so wished. He said that he wanted to allay concerns that some people had assumed that this would not be possible. Now, Nazir Afzal is the National Advisor for Wales's Violence Against Women strategy, and he's highly respected as an expert in measures proposed by the bill. He was invited, at my request, to the Bill Committee, but had to decline as he had been told previously that giving evidence remotely was not possible. Following some discussion yesterday, Mr Afzal then saw fit, under the impression that he would be able to contribute, he contacted House staff again after the announcement of the Leader of the House, which led him to believe that he would be able, therefore, to commit such evidence. He was told again, however, that it was not possible to give evidence remotely. Now, I must emphasise this reflects in no way on the staff of the House, who are doing excellent work in challenging circumstances. I seek advice from you, Speaker. If it proves impossible for Mr Afzal to give evidence directly to the Bill Committee tomorrow, what should the Leader of the House do to correct the record?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving me notice of her point of order, and she does raise an extremely important matter. I understand that the House authorities have urgently been putting measures in place to enable as much virtual witness participation in committees as possible, whilst at the same time enabling members to participate in person, and that work is ongoing. I understand that the programming subcommittee on the bill agreed a witness programme yesterday, she said includes a representative of Welsh Women's Aid. It is of course regrettable on that agreed programme Ms Afzal will not be able to give oral evidence tomorrow, but I have no doubt that the committee would be interested to receive his views in writing, and if there are any further points that she wishes to raise, I'm sure she will find the committee staff extremely helpful. Thank you. In order to allow the safe exit, even though some have already arrived, of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I will suspend the House for 5 minutes. Thank you.